Is that Lucas?
Yes, he signed up for testimony.
Okay.
And he's on the agenda. That's the addition. But he's already on the agenda. That's the addition. Okay, so do I?
Yeah, kind of a casual day for you.
Yeah, super. Yeah, it's my gardening clothes actually.
I'm ready to start.
I'm just going to put it here. So he signed up to actually speak as well.
He's the one that also has testimony that we're adding to the agenda, but he's also wanting to do public testimony.
Like literally anything. Non-alcoholic beer, I almost brought one. Is that what
I'm calling to order the meeting, the City of Salem Budget Committee, for March the 14th, 2024. And with a recorder, please call the roll.
Member Belichick's.
Present.
Member Cohen.
Present.
Member Allen.
Present.
Member Manville.
Present.
Member Vieira Brandel.
Present.
Member Stapleton.
I'm here.
Member Phillips.
Here.
Member Gwen.
Here.
Member Gonzalez.
Here.
Member Julie Hoy.
Here.
Member Nordyke. Member Varney.
Here.
Member Chris Hoy.
Here.
Member Dixon.
Here.
Member Curtis.
Here.
Member Gayer.
Here.
Vice Chair Nishioka.
Here.
Chair Brown.
And I'm here. Will everyone please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And before we get into our additions tonight, I just want to remind the committee that we'll be doing ayes and noes, and so we will not have the recorder recall our names for us when we are ready to vote. So it'll be yes, no, A, I'm not here. And we do have some additions for the agenda that was provided earlier this afternoon, and they are also at your desk. And can I please have a motion to approve the additions to the agenda?
I move approval of the additions to the agenda.
Second.
I have a motion by Member Varney and a second by Member Nordyke. Is there any discussion? Seeing none. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? No opposed. And the motion passes. We'll now move to our items on Agenda 2, public testimony. And I believe we have Mr. Jim Shepke. Thank you, sir.
Chair Brown, members of the committee, I have a handout that's going around for you tonight. And I'm Jim Shepke. I live in Ward 2, and I'm here to talk about the public library. And I've given you some information that's in your agenda, your additional agenda there, and I understand you just got it, but I hope you'll read it. But this handout really summarizes all that information, and I hope will be a very interesting way. It asks the question, what would it take for the Salem Public Library to become average? And so what you see in this table are our peer libraries over there on the left-hand side. And you see some data, like their expenditures, their staffing, what they spend on books, how much their main library is open. And then there's an average of all that at the bottom. And so what you can do here is compare our library to the average, and that will tell you what it would take for our library to be average. But to put it in the simplest terms, if you look at these numbers, what you're going to see is we just about have to double everything. We'd have to double our budget, double our staff, double our hours to be average. And so I just wanted you to have that information tonight. Am I asking you to make that happen in the upcoming fiscal year? Of course not. I'm not asking for that at all. I know that that won't happen. And I will be sharing this with the Revenue Task Force. So it's really their job to come up with an idea for how we could have an average library. I understand that. All I would ask of you is that you aspire to this? That you aspire to this? Can I see some head nods about aspiring to this? Thank you. Thank you. That's all I'm asking for tonight. And I just want you to have the awareness and the information. And thank you very much. Any questions?
We do have some questions on the floor. Member Curtis.
Thank you. So, Jim, in looking at this table, excuse me, it looks like the fact that we're general funded only is unusual.
Yes.
And so we're kind of a
Yes.
anomaly, being
I'm so
general.
glad you noticed that.
And he did not ask me to ask this.
Yes, this column over here is very important to understand because every one of these peer libraries gets dedicated property tax funding from either a local option levy or a library taxing district. And 1, 2, 3, 4 of them currently have local option levies. The Corvallis Library just renewed theirs the same day we were turning down the payroll tax. They passed what they called the livability levy that combined libraries and parks, and they passed it with the 66% yes vote in Corvallis. So I think that's a very interesting thing to note. We're the only library that tries to run on the general fund alone, and it obviously doesn't work. Thank you, Julie.
And I think there was one more. Was Member Cohen? Do you have a question?
It's all along the same lines.
Member Nordyke, did you have a question?
I did, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Shepke, for being here tonight, and I hope that you will make the handout that you gave us publicly available, because it shouldn't just be the people in this room with a physical handout who can see this. It is quite striking, and for the folks at home, it shows just a huge difference in the number of hours of service per week. Salem Public Library, 38. Everybody else has at least 54 hours, one up to 71. So that's quite compelling. But the other thing, Mr. Shepke, that I thought of interest is that while I would expect Multnomah County to be more robust because they're just a larger county, but you also mention in your materials that there are 37 cities in Oregon with populations less than 20,000 people whose public libraries are open more hours per week than Salem.
That's true.
And can you give me an example of what does reduced hours mean? It's not just the number of materials are checked out, because obviously less checkouts because of fewer hours. What are the kinds of impacts that happen to a society that doesn't have access to a library?
I have a friend who told me, Jim, I work exactly the hours that our public libraries are open. So I can no longer go to the public library because I'm working. And he's just one of many. That's the impact. Families, individuals, if you have no evening hours, if you're not open on Sunday, if you have a branch library that's open 10 hours a week, 2 afternoons a week, people can't use the library, and they'll stop. They'll stop using it. They don't have any other choice. And I just have to mention, the other day, the West Salem branch closed. I don't know if you noticed that. They had to close for a whole day, and I asked our city librarian about that. She said it's because they only have 33 staff right now. It just happened that day. They had 11 people out, vacation and sick leave, which is a lot. I will grant you that, but that was the reality. And so that library was closed for the first time in 67 years. And that's the problem that we're facing when you have an underfunded, understaffed library.
I have one more question, if I may. we've heard a lot of talk about why can't we just have volunteers fill these positions. For example, I saw some online chatter when the West Salem branch was unavailable. Why can't we just use volunteers to staff that library for a day? What's your estimation of that? You used to be a librarian, and I'm sure you worked with a lot of volunteers over the course of your career. Why can't our library be volunteer run entirely?
We do use volunteers. We use a lot of volunteers, and other libraries use a lot of volunteers. We could use more if we had a full-time volunteer coordinator, which is what most other libraries have. And you actually have data in this report that was in your packet about volunteer hours, and we ranked 22nd out of 25 libraries last year serving populations greater than 30,000 in the number of volunteers. And it's because we don't have a volunteer coordinator that can recruit volunteers, train volunteers, supervise volunteers. They're just like staff. Sometimes you have to fire volunteers, and you treat them just like staff. So if we had that, if we had the funding to have a volunteer coordinator, you'd see the volunteer program just blossom.
And one more question. Member Stapleton.
Thank you. Thank you, Jim, for coming down. I always enjoy your information on libraries because it's so thorough. All things are not equal on these in more ways than what's represented here. I would love for staff to be able to get this and then for them to add in the differences for each city with the impacts of measures 5 and 50 on each of these different cities, because I think that's going to play into this as well, kind of give us all a more round, full version of what's happening in each of these cities with the impacts of measures 5 and 50 as well included.
Right, that'd be good. And, the Eugene Library had to make reductions this year because they have the same problem we do. But they're reducing off, a budget like this, coming down here, and they're still open the same number of hours as they were last year. They didn't have to cut hours at all.
Yeah, that was going to be my other question for you, was which of these are actually having reductions this year?
I think
is it just-
Beaverton might have some, and I think Eugene might have some.
Yeah.
But again, they're reducing off a very, well-funded library to begin with. We reduced off a very badly funded library.
Yeah, we haven't recovered in a
Never.
lot of ways, really,
No.
since the 90s when we started
You're right.
cutting. So
You're right. 20 years ago, as it says in one of these handouts, our two libraries were open twice as many hours as they are today.
yeah, and this group of people right here in the Revenue Task Force, we're all charged with fixing it, right?
You got it. You nodded your head. I saw that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Shepke. Members also know that there's some correspondence from Mr. Lucas Pittman regarding service reductions, and that should also be in your packet. Move on to the minutes. And may I have a motion to approve the minutes of January the 10th, 2024?
I move approval of the minutes from January 10th, 2024, City of Salem and Urban Renewal Agency Budget Committee meeting.
Second.
I got a motion by Member Varney and a second. Was that you, Member Phillips? No. Member Manville. Thank you. Did you have a question, Member Manville? Okay. All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Ayes have it. Motion passes. Number 4, action items. There are none. Now I will ask CFO Eggleston to walk us through the information items and the outlines. CFO, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Josh Eggleston, Chief Financial Officer. In your original agenda packet, you had a staff report on general fund budget reduction scenarios. We'll be going over that in depth later this evening. And then in your additions agenda, there were responses to budget committee questions, as well as some public testimony. So I'm happy to take any questions on those items now. We will be getting into some of the content later this evening.
Are there any questions for the CFO? DO1, Vice Chair.
Thank you. I may have, maybe we should talk about this later, but the conversation with the library, the suggestion is, Mr. Shepke makes, is potentially a levy, and also the words district come in. And I'm wondering if maybe we can have a little clarity on what, when the library is a city library and if it's a district library, what other agencies or what other things would we have to do to create a district library? Do you have that available? I'm just curious.
I appreciate the question. I don't have an in-depth answer for you this evening. Creating a district is extremely complicated, and it would take quite a few years, actually, to get to that point. It's also on the list that the Revenue Task Force is looking at, along with the levies. So that information will be coming to them. I'm assuming those will be things they want more information on. And I hope you've all been getting updates from the Revenue Task Force. So that information will come via the Revenue Task Force to the Budget Committee.
Thank you. That was a good enough explanation for this point. Thank you.
Are there any additional questions? Yes, Member Hoy.
Thank you. It's actually kind of a process question, but these additions just came in at like 20 after 4 today. Is there a deadline for additions or deletions that's earlier that might give us more time to review the staff report or the changes?
We do have a meeting next week.
Yeah, if I may, there's no formal deadline. Additions can come up until the actual meeting. But you're welcome to reference them at next week's meeting or your meetings in April. I did try to send them out yesterday evening. I know it was late, but there was a lot of questions. We worked to get through them, so I hope they're helpful, but don't feel like you have to read through them tonight. You're welcome to take questions on those next time.
Okay.
Is it helpful?
I just began to question it when I'm supposed to approve the additions and I haven't been able to see them or look at them yet, so.
Duly noted.
Thank you.
And Member Manville.
Thank you, Chair Brown. Josh, is a question about traffic cameras more appropriately later on the agenda or now?
I think later in the agenda.
Okay,
Thank you.
fabulous.
Because it'll be a long conversation. Member Cohen.
Thank you, Chair. Regarding question 28, it is, what is the cost of Salem Fire Department, Salem Police Department to respond to Salem Kaiser Public Schools and Oregon State facilities? As, I don't know if you watch the legislature as closely as I do as a budget analyst for Oregon Health Authority, there was a budget bill that was in this session that basically died in Joint Ways and Means to give City of Salem $6 million as a pilot program for 3 years. Lots of convincing testimony from our legislators, and I appreciate them. The reality is, though, that no one's coming to save us. And yet we still have to supply services to the state and to our school districts. I think it's profoundly unfair as a state employee to demand services from a city without us paying for those services. The answer on here is the city does not have a comprehensive analysis, of the cost of services to the state or school district properties. So my question is, what will it take to have that comprehensive analysis? And what is the legality, if we need the district attorney to answer or attorney to answer, what is the legality of us starting to charge them or, and I don't like this, not responding, right? I don't want to not respond, right? If someone were to have a heart attack at the Capitals, if something, God forbid, were to happen somewhere else, I want us to be first on the scene to respond. But when we're looking at such severe budget cuts, including to fire and police, we are providing services and not getting compensated for that. And that needs to end. So I don't know who's going to provide analysis for that, but that's something I do want to have. The second question is also from 31, requires more complex analysis. I want that analysis. So 31 is about kind of what Mr. Shipke was talking about. What would it cost for us to get our Salem Library back up to services on Sunday and increasing hours to 8 p.m. so that working families or working folks can get in there and go to the library? So I know that those were some of the hot button issues that I've heard from the city that they want to hear about. And that's when I saw the answers needing more analysis, I would like to have that analysis. Thank you.
Thank you, Member Cohen. And I believe staff is here, so duly noted on that. Any additional comments you had, CFO?
If I may, we do know for state properties how much revenue we lose based on property estimates. The cost of service is a little more complicated. I will ask the city manager if you want a motion for those pieces, or if that's something you want to direct staff to do.
Yeah, let's get a motion on that.
Analysis.
First motion, here we go. I move that the city staff provide further analysis to questions 28 and 31 of costs to respond to Salem Kaiser Public Schools and Oregon State facilities, and the amount it would cost to increase hours to Salem Public Library.
Second.
Member Cohen has given us his motion, and it was seconded by Member Phillips. Are there any questions? All in favor? Aye. Any opposed? We do have an opposed, and that would be Member Allen. Any additional questions for CFO Eggleston? Thank you, sir. Moving on to public hearings. There are no public hearings this evening. And we are going to move on to Mr. Staley. If you could share with us your report.
Thank you, Chair Brown and members of the committee. Thank you, Member Cohen, for setting me up here for these comments. One ought not to reject the data merely because one does not like what the data implies. That's, kind of a sock in the nose statement. And it's one that stuck with me from reading Good to Great back in 2001 when Jim Collins published that book. It continues to be one of the most widely read management and leadership books on most people's top 10 all-time best management books, and it certainly is on mine. Chapter 4 in that book is titled, "Confront the Brutal Facts, Yet Never Lose Faith." And he talks about Jim Stockdale, who was a prisoner of war during Vietnam, and how Jim Stockdale never lost sight of the fact that he was in prison and he was uncomfortable, but he also kept his eye on the prize, knowing that at some point he was likely going to get out of there. We need to do the same thing. We need to accept the reality of our situation. And that means looking directly at the facts, doing so with a curious mind. And I know that that can be scary, trust me. When I sat down with Josh to review the 5-year forecast last year for my first time, I was blown away. Like, to see where the expense line was going and see where the revenue line was going, and seeing that they were moving away. I wasn't a math major in college, but I do recognize that if two lines are diverging, they're not suddenly going to come back together again. in space and time. So when I look out at the 5-year forecast, I see those brutal facts. Our revenues have not and will not keep pace with our expenditures. We have been spending fund balance, effectively our savings, to maintain a positive cash flow. And in the next 2 years, we will need to make substantive changes to either our expenses or our revenues to continue to operate. This year, we are reducing our expenses incrementally. That solution won't work forever. More substantive cuts will be required in the near future. In September and October of 2023, last year, we shared several different budget scenarios with City Council that acknowledge these brutal facts and moves us in the direction of closing our budget gap this year and beyond. These scenarios are what have driven the budget adjustments that we recently adopted and will inform our 2025 budget proposal. So, you can pretty much look at what we talked about back in September and October, and that's pretty much what we're going to be coming forward with in April with our budget. The budget proposal, as you see it in April, resulted from those earlier conversations. Again, they are short-term solutions to systemic problems. As you are aware, we also have options for new revenues with the Revenue Task Force. Whether the graph you see is realized will depend on two things: council direction and community support. Without both, we will continue to see reductions. It really is that simple and that brutally hard. This is an extremely difficult work for our leadership team. They are all here in the room this evening, here to answer your questions, should you have them. And we came together as a team and developed some principles that we would use as we made decisions about our budget process and the budget that we would put forward to you and to City Council and the community. And I'm just going to run through those very quickly here so you can see the framework that we're using to make decisions as we propose this budget to you in April. We will strive to align our employee workloads and our capacity to deliver services by adjusting our operations and service levels to reflect our staffing levels. What we did with the library is an excellent example of that. We recognized that our staff was at their absolute limits. They literally came to us and said, "We are at our absolute limits," and we adjusted our hours accordingly so that we can provide the correct staffing based on the hours that we have open. We will value and respect our employees and treat them fairly and equitably, including any employees who may be laid off. We will invest in our people to keep them safe, well-trained, and forward-focused. We will continue to make strategic investments in people and systems that help us lower our costs and better meet our strategic objectives and better serve our community. Things like, how does the city deploy AI to help provide better customer service, for example, is a question that Krishna, who is hiding behind the lectern, I was thinking she wasn't here, and I texted her and thought she might have been in an accident or something. We will work to limit the impacts on core services, police, fire, and the services that support them like IT, legal, and finance, and HR, while recognizing that other services are integral to meeting other needs in our community and the needs of our community members, and to have a thriving community. We will bring a first-team mentality to this process. If anybody knows an author named Patrick Lencioni, you'll recognize the first-team mentality comes out of that book, and it basically means taking an enterprise perspective. Even as a department head, you're there to serve the city, not your individual departments, and that's where we start our conversations. We will be transparent and open throughout this process. I have been sharing these facts with our leadership team and with our employees as frequently as we have new information to share. Just last week, I sent basically the same message to all city employees, letting them know where we are in the process, advising them of the Budget Committee work and the Revenue Task Force work so that they can be aware of where we are in this process. We'll make our best recommendations, but we'll accept and admit that we will not have all the information that we need to make these decisions, and that, even as we move forward here, new information will be coming forward that will better define where we are. We're in negotiations right now with 2 of our primary unions. Until those contracts are settled, there's a bit of information that we don't know yet that we'll be adding to this process as we go forward. We will work with council and the community to consider revenue options. However, we will plan for no new revenues in #24 or '25 and beyond. So we are planning as if no new revenues are going to occur. We certainly are hoping and working towards the alternative. And we'll find a path forward. It will lead to a different organization where we are intentional about the services and programs we provide. It will continue to be a great organization doing great work with great people in service to our community. I share this with you so that you can see the commitment on the part of your employees to do the best work for the city, continue to deliver excellent services, and recognize through these challenges, with the support of council and the community, we can get through this. I've also included on the back page a list of the Budget Committee meetings and the Revenue Task Force meetings and our community open houses, so you can have those at your fingertips. As you can see, there is an abundance of opportunities for the community and for you to engage in this process. We finished our focus group process, and we'll be reporting out on that work next week and as that information comes available. So a lot going on here, and we're ready to get started. So who's next, Josh?
Thank you, Mr. City Manager. Are there any questions for him? Seeing none. CFO Eggleston, it's all you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Again, Josh Eggleston, the city's Chief Financial Officer. We're going to look at those dates one more time. As a reminder, this evening and next week were added to give the Budget Committee an opportunity to hear more about the city's sources and uses of funds, budget reduction options, and to discuss priorities prior to receiving the city manager's proposed budget on April 17th. The proposed budget is still being finalized, but will include the reductions from option 1 that we're going to review later this evening. The next meetings are outlined on the slide with the things that we have to have the Budget Committee complete in red. So the Budget Committee as a whole is an advisory body to City Council, but there's certain tasks in Oregon budget law that have to be completed by the Budget Committee or they simply can't move forward. One of them is the state revenue sharing on possible uses. There's another public hearing when it gets to council, but you have to have both of them. We have to approve the property tax levies, both for the operating side, for the permanent rate, even though it's the same every year, we still have to approve it. The general obligation bond levy. And then the final largest task is to recommend a fiscal year 2025 budget to the City Council. It is a one budget that's recommended. I know there's been some discussions about possible options. The Budget Committee can recommend a single budget to City Council. So a little context, and I know this might be some review for some of you, but I learn something new all the time, and I hope you will as well with this presentation. I'm going to give some high-level overview, and then I'm going to turn it over to departments to go through their specific areas. And all the numbers that we're talking about tonight are based on the fiscal year 2024 budget as amended in February after those reductions happened. So the city's total budget is over $750 million, but can be broken into 24 separate funds and 7 fund types. For many of our conversations, we focus on the general fund, but as you can see, it still is a relatively small portion compared to the whole enterprise. One reason this is important is because of the restrictions on revenue are often based on the fund or fund type. A special revenue fund means that there are specific restrictions on the use of that revenue. Similarly, enterprise funds operate like a business and the fees for service are restricted to that use. Internal service funds are services where primary customers are internal users. You'll hear more about those tonight from several different departments. But those funds are also generally restricted since many of their users have restricted revenue sources. So if you were to say, not offer a service anymore, those funds would be allocated back to their user departments. They wouldn't be available just for any use. I'm just going to pause to see if there's any questions here.
There is. Member Stapleton.
Thank you, Chair. So Josh, I know some people ask about, what are the different buckets? Is this a really good picture of the buckets?
This is a really good high-level picture of the buckets. Yes.
Okay. So then within each of these is more buckets, or?
Correct. So these are fund types. So we have 7 fund types, and then within those, there's individual funds. So like one example there on the far right, you can see the enterprise funds. We talk about the utility fund a lot. We don't talk as much about the 911 call center. We're about to talk a lot about the EMS fund, and then regional records is the smallest one. But those all operate like a business.
Okay, so sorry, clarification. So we have the bigger buckets in bold, right? But then at each bullet point, are those additional buckets within that bolded bucket?
Correct.
Does that question make
So
sense? Okay.
the budget can be broken into 24 separate funds that are budgeted,
Okay,
with trust funds being all lumped together.
okay, and so there's 27 of them there?
Yes,
Okay.
24.
Thank you.
Thank you. Member Cohen.
Thank you. For the general audience, could you define what is restricted and what is unrestricted?
Yeah, absolutely. So restricted means that's either restricted by federal, state, or local ordinance, law, resolution, policy. The use is generally restricted for a specific purpose. One example is like the transportation fund. They're under special revenue funds. The state highway revenue, often referred to as a gas tax, comes into that fund, and it's restricted to right-of-way maintenance, so streets, sidewalks, things like that.
And then from that, could you describe for this group if certain funds within, say, the general fund are restricted only to the general fund, or could we propose motion to move some of the stuff off the general fund and into a fund that is better off?
You could not. There might be certain instances where you could maybe make a justification, but a general answer is no. Everything that's in the general fund is there for a reason. If you pulled it out, I've often talked about pulling planning services out of the general fund because it has a revenue source, but you're not sticking in a different fund, it would go in its own fund.
And further clarification, because of the library, if we wanted to pull the library out of the general fund and fund it solely by a local option levy, is that something, what would we need to do in order to, would that be a motion? Would that be up to the voters? Would that be what?
Stepping back, you'd have to have the local option levy approved by voters. As part of that, you could definitely direct that use based on the ballot language. So the ballot language could restrict the use. And then it could go into a special revenue fund specifically for the library.
In effect, taking the portion of the library's general fund out of the general fund if it's paid for by the local option levy?
Potentially. There's a lot of complications there and nuances. We have issues with local option levies here in Marion County specifically with compression and other considerations that makes it more challenging on that list that Jim provided. A lot of those areas look a lot different, their tax environment. We're constrained here on the Marion County side of Salem.
Thanks.
Are there any additional questions on the floor? Yes, Member Varney.
Thank you. What was the number again for the total of all funds? I just wanted to make sure I had it written down for the total amount.
For the total budget?
Uh-huh.
So it's just over 250 million, or 750 million, and that's just the city of Salem. The urban rural agency is a separate budget.
Okay, Okay, thank you.
Any additional questions?
I see Member Dixon online.
Perfect. Member Dixon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Josh, are there procedures for creating a special revenue fund, or do they create themselves?
They do not create themselves. They can be created by ordinance or resolution. Often they are created through the budget resolution. So through the budget process, you can add a new fund. You do have to have the revenue in place first, or reasonably expect that revenue to come into the city.
Thank you.
Thank you, Member Dixon. Any other questions on the floor? Mr. CFO?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Moving on, I'm going to provide some context to hopefully set the stage for the department presentations we're going to walk through. Again, it will be a review. So this is a little different look at the budget, and the $750 million number applies to the previous graph. This is actually just the operating fund, so it excludes construction. So it doesn't have the construction fund. So this is about $530 million. And this is a department look. This isn't something we normally view this way, but it's the way we're looking at the information this evening. So Public Works, Fire, Police, and this is regardless of fund. And then if you were to...
Mr. CFO, we have one question on the floor. Member Varney.
Sorry.
Member Nordike.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mayor and council has .4, and I'm just wondering, since we're unpaid, is that the Chinese food we had tonight?
No, the budget committee expenses actually come out of finance, but definitely on the evenings where you meet, the food does come out of that budget, and we're going to walk through that specifically, what's included there later this evening.
Great, because I'm still unpaid over here.
Understood.
Duly noted. Any other questions on the floor? Mr. CFO?
So this graph is just the general fund departments. We'll be going through each of these fairly in depth, but when you think of the pie that is the general fund, this is it. You can see the vast majority, about 60%, is police and fire. This is 181.5 million in total. 181.5. And that's after the reductions earlier this year. I'm going to spend a little bit of time here just because this is going to show up, this nuance later on in the presentation for each department director, and I don't want them to have to explain it. So I'm going to attempt to explain it once, and then we have to come back to it. We can. So in the general fund, we have vast, mostly unrestricted revenues, but we do have some restricted revenues. So unrestricted revenues, you can see them listed there: property taxes, franchise fees, city operations fees, court fines, parking fines, interest, miscellaneous. So there's several other just small amounts that go in there. We also have dedicated or restricted revenues. So when I mentioned like the state revenue sharing public hearing that is held at the budget committee and at the city council, that revenue has to be dedicated to a service. So the budget committee looks at the possible uses, city council looks at the proposed uses. Historically, it's been dedicated to police patrol. So that's a dedicated, restricted resource. You can't use it for anything else. We don't have a problem doing that because it's a very small amount compared to the cost of police patrol. But that's one example of a dedicated resources. Similarly, marijuana sales tax, fees for service. When I talked about planning fees, those go into the planning cost center. The costs come out. Permits and internal charges and transfers. Those are all restricted use revenues for those services. Again, it doesn't create a challenge. We use up all of those resources plus some, and we'll be going through that. In the gray, the indirect cost allocation plan, ICAP, support service charge, whatever you want to call it. That's the allocation of central services, so finance, city manager's office, HR, IT, legal. Those are all housed in the general fund. We saw them as part of the pie on the previous slide, but all funds use them. So we allocate those costs to the other funds, and the general fund gets reimbursed. So when you look at a position in finance or the city manager's office, the full cost isn't borne by the general fund. And that varies depending on the use and the person It's a fairly complex method to allocate the costs.
And we have some questions on the floor. Member Nordyke, you have a question?
I do not.
Do not? Member Allen?
Thank you. Josh, you mentioned on the graph on page 5 was 181.5. The revenues on page 6 are, I didn't add it all up specifically, but like it's around 216. So can you help me understand the difference between the 181.5 and the 216?
Yeah, so it's a picture of total resources, so it includes beginning working capital. So savings account, fund balance, our safety net, the insurance fund, whatever you want to call that, dollar amount that's built in here. And you'll see that when you look at different departments. You won't see it for general fund areas, but other areas. One that comes to mind is building and safety. They have a large fund balance and a small amount of expenditure. So you'll see more budgeted resources than you'll see budgeted expenses.
And we have another question. Member Cohen.
Thank you. First, I'd like to thank you for having all these pie-shaped charts for Pi Day. Happy 3.14 to everybody out there. For marijuana sales tax, can you describe how much the city of Salem is getting from that, and what does that go towards?
So I'm hoping someone's going to help me with the number. We'll see if that shows up here in a minute. It's a 3% local sales tax on marijuana administered by the Department of Revenue. So we don't have much hands-on involvement with it other than we passed it and they take a share of the administration. Then it's dedicated, it goes into the police patrol.
Do you need some assistance with that, Mr. CFO?
Trevor is saying just under 2 million.
Good evening, Callie Leinenbach, Budget Manager. In 23, we received almost 1.3 million for the marijuana sales tax.
You said it was 3.1?
1.3.
1.3?
Yeah.
I will say that's not the total that the city receives from marijuana. We also have a state share revenue, which is I think where you get to that just under 2 million in total for marijuana sales tax. But it's a state shared portion as opposed to a locally enacted tax.
Are there any additional questions? Yes, Member Dixon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Josh, I want to follow up on Member Allen's question. How is it that there's over $200 million in general fund revenues, but it's not budgeted for as an expense? Can you walk me through that again? It doesn't seem to be all available for spending.
That is correct. So that's, and I apologize for the confusion. General fund revenues is a little deceptive. It should say general fund resources. Generally, revenues are current in the year you're in. Resources encompasses carryovers, that beginning working capital. But that is the difference. So the general fund has an unappropriated ending fund balance each year. At least right now with our current fund balance level, our expenses, even with contingency, some of that fund balance remains unbudgeted.
Member Dixon.
Just to follow up, if you don't mind, is that part of budget policy? Is that, are there legal reasons you don't budget for that?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. So if you look at the Oregon Budgeting Manual, you don't have to, I promise. If you do, you have to have good faith estimates. So you have to have a reasonable expectation that what you budget is likely to occur. So we can't budget for things that we know aren't going to happen necessarily. There's some other ways to get around that where like we budget for contingency, but that's limited. You can only budget a certain portion in contingency. But in general, our department budgets, we don't want to fully appropriate the general fund. We need that carryover. We need that cash flow to fund services, actually make payroll but until we get property tax revenues in November. So while it's unappropriated, that doesn't mean it's not being used. So it's the kind of difference between cash flow operations and budget authority. Two very different things for this for the general fund specifically.
So one more follow-up, would the cash flow be the unrestricted?
The cash is pooled, so it doesn't necessarily matter. All the restricted revenues are going to come in, and our expenses are going to use up all that unrestricted revenue first. I would call it a first in, first out. So the unrestricted revenue is going to be what's left over year to year.
And Mr. CFO, was there another question you had, Member Dixon?
I'll work on it.
Thank you.
No, not now, thank you.
Okay, so Mr. CFO, so that restriction, those fees continue year after year, so they're just left there? The restricted revenue, you said that continues year after year?
So we continue annually to get new revenue. So like the marijuana tax that we collect, we get that every year and we use it every year. So the balance that you carry forward is unrestricted.
Got it. Okay, thank you. Any additional questions on the floor? Please continue.
And that is actually my final slide.
Okay. Next, we'll have community services by our Deputy City Manager, Mr. Archer.
Thank you, Chair Brown and members of the Budget Committee. Good evening. I'm Scott Archer, Deputy City Manager for Community Services. And so just quickly, I'm going to walk through an overview of the Community Services Department current fiscal year budget. Before I get into the budget part of this, I want to tell you a little bit about what Community Services is. The Community Services Department was created in the current fiscal year as a result of reorganization of existing positions, services, programs, and facilities. No new positions were created in the forming of community services. It was just taking different components that were, and different people that were previously under a variety of departments and kind of in different operational areas and putting them into one department together. As you see on the organizational chart here, the department includes our library, parks and recreation, urban forestry, Center 50 Plus, which is senior services, homelessness and unsheltered response, human rights, youth development program, neighborhood services, which is our neighborhood associations and related services, cultural tourism and TOT, our transient occupancy tax, and public art is also part of this. And the purpose of bringing these services together under a single department was so that the city can better serve Salem residents by aligning work that has similarities. It creates synergy across the enterprise and just generally brought together some services that align better with each other. This work is intended to enhance and enrich lives, improve health and livability of our community and our residents, and to provide education and prevention over a lot of different types of services. And so that's what the Community Services Department is. A few kind of key facts and statistics for your information, just to give you a little bit more of a snapshot. We manage 2,350 acres of park property across 92 parks. We have 29 miles of trails. Last year in the Parks and Recreation Division, we leveraged around 64,000 volunteer hours, which is phenomenal, and we have a really strong volunteer program within that area of operations. We planted over 1,400 trees. We hosted 122 events at Riverfront Park. We held dozens of city special events and programs. We have a robust softball program that I'm sure most of you know of. Last year we had 630 total softball teams participate. That equated to 12,600 players, and we hosted 4 USA softball tournaments of some type or another, which is substantial for bringing, people to our city to spend money and support our economy. Our public library, we had over 315,000 people walk through the doors last year. We are on pace this year to circulate over 1 million items. And this will actually be about double of the prior year. We've made a concerted effort to really encourage the use of the library and circulation of our materials. We also hosted over 500 programs, events, and outreaches. Our Center 50 plus senior services, we currently have about 13,000 registered patrons. We have an average daily attendance of 756 people. We have 438 volunteers officially registered with our program. That equates to about almost 79,000 hours, people hours of service per year. And our WOW van, which is our mobile service outreach program, we will reach about 10,000 people this year. In our homeless response, we also refer to that as our SOS team. In the last couple of years, 465, or I think it's about 465 unsheltered, previously unsheltered people exited emergency shelter for positive destinations. We remove an average of 23 tons of trash per month from city public areas. Our Youth Development Services program serves over 1,000 youth annually. We support 17 neighborhood associations in the city. And our Neighborhood Services program also supports some different events and activities. Just this last year, we started our Viva Salem program, or our big cultural event, which was a success, and we'll be back again this year. We host Fun Fridays. We also hosted a Spanish resource fair. And in our TOT program, we provided in the current fiscal year 44 grants to qualifying agencies. So looking at our budget, this is our fiscal year 24 revenue overview. Josh hit on some of this, but this kind of dives a little bit deeper than that. The total revenue for community services is $30.7 million. The Community Services Department has a significant percentage of revenues that can only be spent in accordance with the way they were collected. Josh spoke to the restricted versus unrestricted funds. In the general fund restricted revenue shown here, these typically can only be used to go back into the same programs that they're collected. So these are fees and charges, building and park rental fees, our funds that we receive from our library regional co-op, also called the CCRLS, which has a distribution formula based on circulation, which, as we continue to reduce hours, has the potential to reduce that amount of revenue we receive through that program. Our cultural tourism program, this is our transient occupancy tax, also known as a lodging tax. The city charges a base rate of 9%, and then there is also something called a tourism promotion area. We shorten that to TPA. Quite often you'll hear that. That is also shown here separately. That's an additional 2% that was self-imposed by the hotel motel operators in the city, and that has to be renewed every 5 years, and it's actually coming up for a renewal or an expiration and consideration of renewal this coming year. The last item on here is our trust and agency. This is donations, estates, and other kind of special revenues that we might receive over the course of a year. In our expenditures, so the total expenditures here is $26.2 million for the Community Services Department. So we're looking at, in our general fund portion of that, we're looking at $9.3 million in parks. That is to maintain, manage, operate all of those acres and parks that I mentioned earlier and those miles of trails. This also includes parks planning, tree maintenance, and urban forestry. Our library is $5.5 million. I will note that this does include the mid-year reduction that was implemented last month. It was, that amendment was approved by council. Josh mentioned that as well, that this reflects the updated budget. Obviously, any further reductions will have significant impacts on our operations at both the main library and the West Salem branch. Our cultural and tourism program, this represents, the expenditures here represent those funds that are collected from those hotel motel taxes, and they get distributed back out for purposes specifically related to culture, heritage, and tourism. And so in this, we will spend money to support Travel Salem, the Salem Convention Center. Each of those two entities receive a specified percentage of the revenues that we receive on an annual basis. This also provides support to our cultural and heritage facility operators and a number of event grants. So these are our annual granting programs. And then there's also a portion of this that does get directed to parks and recreation operations. Those are uses that are qualified by the definition of how those funds can be utilized for the prescribed uses. Again, the TPA, this is the additional 2%. Most of that goes directly to Travel Salem. There is a small percentage that is retained by the city for administrative charges. So with those services, I'm going to talk just for a moment about staffing, but with those services, let me back up just a second here. So the biggest piece of this pie is the general fund, and so most of what we do in community services is general fund supported. So as we've continued to talk about, and City Manager Staley spoke to earlier, the revenue and general fund challenge that we have is already impacting the provision of these services that are provided by community services. And without some solution to our general fund issue and our revenue challenge, we foresee some potential further reductions that will significantly decrease our levels of service in most of what's on the left side of the page there. So that is something to note. So the last couple slides I've got are just a couple of graphs that show our staffing levels. The staffing levels have been relatively flat, or even in some cases have declined over the past 10 years. This is a 10-year look at the staffing levels. The career positions over time are, so keeping in mind that these are just the actual positions, and we have to contextualize those in the growth of the city. That relation is not necessarily shown here, as well as the demand for services. So for example, when I say demand for services in our parks operations, we've continued to add park land, or we've developed existing parks, and that will then generate additional maintenance needs and additional needs to take care of those things. So as those demands for service increase and our levels of staffing remain relatively flat, our level of service decreases with that. The library, as you see here on this chart, the library has had generally flat staffing over this time period, with the exception of the current year, which is actually showing the reduction that we made this mid-fiscal year. Parks operations has had a few increases to staffing over the last 9 or 10 years. Note that on the very far left part of the graph, it goes from 0 to 32. That's simply because the parks operations used to be under Public Works, so that moved into the general fund about 10 years ago. So that's what that's about. The position increase in the current fiscal year, going from 44 to 49, is simply due to the addition of the SOS homeless response team. So that was a new portion of a program that was added. Recreation has had one FTE position over this same time period, and that's a riverfront amphitheater manager that is actually funded by the TOT revenue. And then my last slide is the couple more of our program staffing levels. Center 50 has increased by a couple of positions over this same time period. And then the last one is administration. This increase going from 0 to 11 over a 10-year period and jumping just in that 1 year is just related to that reorganization that I spoke of earlier. Again, there were no new positions created. So that is my quick walkthrough of community services, and I would be happy to entertain your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Archer. Are there any questions on the floor? Yes, Member Curtis.
Thank you. I've been sort of trying to bore into a little bit the homeless, various fundings for the homeless services that we provide. And I'm wondering, well, a lot of stuff, but so a draft report that I looked at today by Moss Adams said that the city has very, sort of uncoordinated, not uncoordinated, but there's not one, specific place that you can go to find out what is the budget, what do we spend on homeless services. But they estimated that in fiscal year 22-23, about $13.4 million was spent directly on homeless services, another 10.5 on secondary, law enforcement or whatever. So I'm wondering, and I'm going to be looking at this, probably throughout our deliberations, but where does that, what piece of your budget goes for homeless? Because you said that you do fund it, the SOS team, but that's just that one little piece of it, I'm assuming.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So within the general fund of the community services department and its general fund is that is our what we call our homeless response team, our SOS Salem Outreach Service, and that is basically our cleaning up of encampments, removal of trash, and responding to some of those types of issues. I would look to Josh perhaps to help answer the question of you're correct, there are a number of other funding sources where money provides support to some of the agencies in the community to assist with our housing issues. And Josh, I don't know if you want to respond to any of that.
Again, Josh Eggleston, Chief Financial Officer. So the SOS team, the portion that Scott showed is currently offset by a state grant for sheltering and cleanup. So last year and the current year, and we're projecting next year, the entire cost of that SOS team is being covered by state grants. So while it resides in the general fund, it has an offsetting revenue that comes in.
Okay. May I ask another question?
Follow up, Member Curtis.
Thank you. So where does the graffiti removal, where do they reside?
In the police department. So it's
in
going
the
to come up
police
soon.
department.
And he's coming up soon.
Well, I'll just leave it there, but I've got about 50 more questions, but I won't bore you all with it.
We have all night.
No, that's okay.
If I might add, though, to that last question about graffiti removal, we do have a standalone graffiti removal division within police. Also within our parks, as you can imagine, we incur a lot of graffiti issues in our parks. The parks maintenance team deals with that directly for the most part. Okay. So that just gets sort of absorbed into our work with parks, just so you're aware.
Member Gwen?
I was just curious, back on page 5, slide number 10, and it's not a big deal, I was just curious what it is. You said you gave 44 TOT grants in 2024. I was just curious what those are.
The TOT grants are a combination of our facility operators, so our heritage facilities, Children's Museum, those types of facilities, and then most of those are in the form of supporting community events. So you can apply, each year we have an open application period, and our TOT board oversees that process and recommends that, and actually then brings recommendations to the council, and that gets funded through the budget process. So events like Hoop Fest, and I could list about, I think, somewhere near 40 or 35 of those or so. There's about 9 or 10 that are facility grants and about 35 or so that are individual events.
Thank you. We have a few more questions. We have Member Guyer, and then Member Stapleton, and then Member Dixon.
Yes, thank you. I was wondering about the softball tournaments. Which parks are holding those, and are those mostly youth tournaments or adult tournaments?
Wallace Marine Park, our complex there, is primarily where those occur, and it's both youth and adult. Yeah.
Okay. The next question on top of that would be: are there any plans for artificial turf at any of the city parks to host more tournaments?
Would love to do that. It really improves the playability, and you can get a lot more use out of those. Right now, that is not in our near-term plans, but that's certainly something that we'd love to explore. That comes out of capital money, which is kind of a different thing. We can get into that, system development charges and some grants and different things. So not as much impacted by the general fund, but yes, that's certainly something we would love to do at some point.
Member Stapleton.
Thank you. Last year, we were talking about the West Salem Library, branch library, and the land that it sits on.
Yeah.
I know we had concerns about that relationship because it's new. Has there been any movement there?
Yes, we've had some conversation. So just so everybody knows quickly, the West Salem Library branch resides on the Roth's owned property behind the store. The city owns the building. The store ownership owns the underlying property. We have a longstanding agreement that for almost nothing, the city is able to have its West Salem Library reside on that property. The stipulation there is if we ever cease to operate it as a library, the land will revert back, and we have a pretty short and aggressive time period in the contract that says we have to remove the building and restore the property to its original condition. We are in conversation with the management and the ownership to see if we can amend that understanding so that we don't lose the ability to have that still sited there should we have to close that facility for some time.
And online, Member Dixon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Is the distribution of TOT grants to community groups required by city ordinance or statute, or is that discretionary?
Is it by ordinance that we do that, Josh? Or? Yeah. So it's a combination of both ordinance or city code, and some of it is just a policy level issue. But yes, there are prescribed amounts that we distribute to each of those different pieces of that. So it is prescribed. We can certainly provide that information. We've got documents that show you exactly where that is directed from and how it is distributed.
And just a follow-up question, if I may.
Please.
Is there a requirement that a certain percentage of transient occupancy tax go to that purpose? Is that question clear?
If I'm understanding it correctly, the transient occupancy tax has very specified ways in which it can be spent. Essentially, it has to be spent on cultural activities, tourism, things of that nature, and it is very specifically prescribed. And then there's a percentage of the distribution within that. So, for example, a specified percentage goes to Travel Salem, specified percentage goes to the convention center, and then we have our granting programs and some that goes to supporting some of the city's own services and programs.
And one more follow-up, is the amount that's going to the granting programs, is that specified, is a specific amount or a specific percentage specified, say, in city ordinance, or is that discretionary? Obviously, it has to fit within the terms of the transient occupancy tax. My question is, does some of that transient occupancy tax have to go to that purpose?
There is The best way I can answer that, I think, shortly, is there is some level of flexibility with that portion of the use of that portion of the funding.
Thank you.
Were there any additional questions? Yes, Member Varney.
Thank you very much. Well, since we're talking about TOT funds, my question is, when there is an event that requires additional police, law enforcement, security, maintenance costs, et cetera, can those be funded with TOT funds then, since they are actually providing a service for that event?
Excellent question. I'm not sure what the answer is, but I could find out.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. And Member Bailicheks.
Thank you, Chair Brown. Thanks for the great presentation and all the great services you provide to the people of Salem. My question is about urban forestry, and does that include the publicly owned trees in transportation right-of-ways? And I'm going to trying to lead into the question, if a tree falls in a road and there's no money to clean it up, does it just lie there?
If a tree falls in the forest. So you're going to hear at some point from our Public Works Director, Brian Martin, and part of that operation and that funding comes from Public Works, and I think it's from some of our street funds, but I can't speak to that. The urban forestry team is housed in the Parks Department. We receive some of that support from the Public Works Department, but we respond to all publicly owned trees. So we maintain and respond to anything that's a publicly owned tree. I hope that answers your question. And our team is very responsive, and if something like what you described happens, we would respond to that. We have the ability to get out and take care of those kinds of needs.
Yes, thank you. That's an answer to the question. Just trying to tie in the forests with the transportation system.
Yeah.
So I do have a question to follow up to that. So your question was, if the tree falls, like who cleans it up, right? And we're like, where's that money come from? And so back to the ice storms that we discussed a long time ago, when we do have that type of, environmental issue with trees falling, is that contracted that they're going to pick it up, or is it city people that's going to clean it up?
So both. So city employees and contracted services, specifically to the ice storm event. That was lots of contracted services. Eventually, we got reimbursement from FEMA and insurance for most of it. But ongoing funding for street tree maintenance specifically, it's in the right-of-way. It falls under that state highway revenue eligibility. That's why that funding goes to parks to make sure they're able to respond in a timely manner.
Got it. Were there any other follow-up questions? And I do have one for you. So on page 5, and I think it's slide 10, it was the Community Services Department and the Neighborhood Services.
Which slide is this?
Is the Viva Salem, the Fun Fridays, and Spanish Resource Fair. Those types of events, and I think this goes to Member Varney's question, when it comes to the cleanup of those events, that's done by city people also, our staff?
Correct, yeah.
Right.
All associated costs with running the program, running the event, and then, setting up and taking down would all be part of our overall. Some of that support actually comes from our Parks and Recreation team. They get quite involved with our large events as well.
Got it. So my question is this. So thinking that, this is Women's History Month, right? So when we put on cultural events, how do we come to the conclusion that it's just going to be a Spanish event? For instance, Native Americans, women. Are there other events that represent other cultures too, or no?
I know that there are, sometimes the city puts on events, and sometimes other entities in the city or the community also host cultural types of events. With the Viva Salem event specifically, and that was, the first of those was just this last fall, that was initiated before I started with the city, so I don't know that I can give you the history of how that one came to be, but we certainly would look to explore other types of events. We have a limited amount of funding to do that, but again, sometimes the city does events and sometimes other entities do events, and we certainly also look to help to try to support those as we can. For example, we often have the facilities where those take place. We can certainly do more, and yeah.
Got it. So but this particular event, this one is funded by the city.
That's correct.
And so if I were to put on my equity lens, somebody could say, well, are there other cultures and events that we should have? Okay?
Yeah, that's fair.
Okay. Thank you for that clarity. Any other additional questions? Yes, Member Nordike.
Thanks so much. The softball tournaments and other increasing variety of events that are coming our way. I know, Scott, we had talked a little bit in the past about taking a look at our fee structure for these events. And I'm just curious, can you say right now, when we host these softball tournaments, just as one example, I don't mean to pick on softball just because I play this, I'm terrible at it.
But
since you mentioned it specifically, it was like swing and a miss. That was a strike,
tennis.
For sure. No bueno. Like I said, not my area of expertise. But I'm just curious, are the softball tournaments revenue neutral when you take into account the cleanup and the other things that Councilor Barney pointed out, or is there a net positive? And what in general are we doing to examine our fee structure for the increasing popularity of our parks, our riverfront park especially?
Very timely question. Given our discussions around revenue and looking forward, what we are doing is, first of all, in the current planning for the upcoming fiscal year, we are actually reviewing, I would say sort of informally but professionally with our own staff, looking at areas where we can probably get away with increasing some revenues for things, and actually softball is one of those areas that probably has some room for raising some revenues. But more formally, going into probably the next year or so, we're planning to engage in a formal fee study where we would hire somebody to do a market analysis and say, your fees are comparable or not comparable with other cities or entities that do these same types of services. And we can also then do where we set some objectives within that plan more formally to say, again, just using softball as an example, softball should be 100% cost recovery type of program. So what do we need to do to get there? What would the fees need to be raised to? And we're going to do that across all of our programs and services in parks, recreation, Center 50, et cetera. So that will be taking place. And I will say that that program is not at a fully supported level by the fees that are charged, but there's still some room there.
So to be clear, you're saying that for the softball tournaments, they're not revenue neutral. They do cost us a little money right now to host them. I'm seeing a nod yes by the CFO.
Yeah, so there's a little bit of a distinction. The softball, we run leagues and our kind of our own local programs, and then we run or we host these national tournaments. Those are probably more on the revenue positive side if you just singled those out, but they're part of our whole recreation program, so it doesn't quite break down that way. But those definitely are more likely to be looked at as revenue positive events.
Thank you. Any other follow-up questions before we continue? Thank you, Mr. Archer.
Thank you.
Next, we will have an update from Fire. Chief Nablat, please come on.
Well, good evening, Chair Brown, Vice Chair Nishioka, and Budget Committee members. My name is Mike Niblock. I'm the Fire Chief, and I've got 5 minutes. I'm going to set my watch here because that's what they told us. So, and then lots of time for questions if you have them. I just want to start with just a brief explanation of what is under the umbrella of the fire department. So of course the fire department and emergency medical services are under that umbrella. Willamette Valley Communications, our 911 dispatch center, is under that umbrella, and radio shops as well. Our dispatch center is the second busiest center in the state. We cover all the way to Lincoln City. We cover about 420,000 residents across those 29 police and fire agencies that we dispatch for. So very, very busy center. The only one busier is in Portland. So some of our services I mentioned a few minutes ago, emergency medical services is about 72% of what we do. We still do fight fires. We have them often, but our most important call and our most often call is emergency medical services, critical life safety issues. We're a full service department. All these programs I'm about to mention are value added. So all of our firefighters are a firefighter on a truck. They're paramedic, but they also have specialty skills and participate in these other teams, so we can provide these services to the community as a value added service. We participate in the hazardous materials response team, which is a state-sponsored team. We're Team 13, Team Lucky 13, and we run from Lincoln City all the way to Sisters, Oregon. We have a huge district. Most of our calls are in Salem for that. We provide aircraft rescue firefighting response with the recent addition of flights at the airport. So we have crews trained to deal with aircraft rescue and crashes. We have a full gamut of tech rescue skills, including confined space, which we provide for public works, rope, high angle, low angle, tech rescue, trench rescue. We also have a water rescue team that responds on the Willamette and anywhere else on any other bodies of water. We have lots of creeks, lots of streams, and people get in those, and they're a lot swifter than you think they are. We also have fire prevention and safety education within the fire department. They help us with all the new building permits and making sure that everything is fire safe as it's constructed, and then inspections, and then education for juvenile fire setters and things like that. We also, under the umbrella of the fire department, have the citywide emergency management and preparedness, a division of one person. They take care of the entire city. So they do stuff like CERT training, and those types of things. And then when we have an event, like we had the pandemic for quite a period of time, our emergency operations center was open 17 months during the pandemic. So that's a pretty unusual thing for us. But those folks were engaged in that the entire time. Recently, we've had a lot of wildland urban interface fires. So that's something we also provide, and we've been thankfully, we've had very few structures lost and no lives lost and no injuries in the last several years with some pretty significant fires here around the community. We also participate in community service and outreach, and we have 4 SWAT paramedics. So they're embedded into the SWAT team with the police department. They're there to provide medical aid to a police officer or a suspect after an event. So just to make sure everybody's safe, they can provide that critical emergency aid. So I want to talk a little bit about, on this slide here, we're looking at current deployment comparisons from 2011 to 2023. And so we've seen a pretty significant increase in our population, about 13.3% in that time. We've seen an incredible increase in our call volume from 16,910 to 32,040 last year, 89% increase in call volume. So requests for 911. I will tell you that so far this year, we're up almost 14% in the first 2 months. And that's going to equate to about 4,500 calls this year if that trend continues. So we're going to be somewhere around the 36,000 call volume mark by the end of this year, which is an incredible growth. We saw 16.9% growth from 2020 to 2021. So we're seeing another little spurt right now. And normally January and February are not our busiest months. And we're already up over 700 calls from last year in those 2 months. And then our 24-hour response resources. So in 2011, we had 43 people on duty handling those 16,000 calls. And today we have 43 people on duty handling 32,000 calls. So considerably busier. This is a current deployment call load versus dispatch to arrive percentage. The red line is our ability to meet the standard, and we shoot to meet the national standard, which is arrival in 5 minutes, at the 90th percentile. And you can look back at 2011, we were in the 72 to 73% when we were running 16,000 calls. And then as the call volume increases with the same resources, you see your ability to meet that standard is declined significantly. In 2019, we had a crossover of the two lines. And as the city manager mentioned earlier, anytime you have diverging lines like that, it takes time to get them back together, and you want to see these lines go in the other direction. And last year, right at 50%. So 50% of the time when somebody had a critical emergency, we were able to get there in 5 minutes. And that's concerning if you're on the wrong side of that 50%. So just another way to look at this map on the left depicts where our fire stations are located in the community. They're well positioned. And this is our dispatch to arrival time at the 90th percentile. We achieved at 49.9% last year. And we only time the most critical calls. So, if you have a broken ankle, we're not timing that one. If you have something that's non-critical that we don't go to, lights and sirens. So 13,621 of our 32,000 calls were critical, life matters, time matters calls. So last year, 6,824 people of that 13,000 did not get that 5-minute response. They had to wait longer for us to get there. And I've said this many times, if you have a heart attack or you're not breathing or you're having respiratory arrest or anything like that, your brain starts dying at 6 minutes. So if it takes us 8 minutes to get there, that's not going to be a good outcome for you or your family. So it's critical that we're able to achieve that level. 49.9% is basically an F grade. So we always try to predict out, and this chart is built on, I think, 6% call growth per year. Right now we're at 14. So some years we have the outlier events, but this is just a look forward to 2029. And it's estimated that we will add 10,000 calls for service by 2029. Now, having said that, I just told you we might add 4,500 next year. So this is a conservative look. This is best case scenario. I think it's probably going to be worse than this. By 2029, and this is also taken into consideration, we're talking about potentially closing fire stations in 26 and 28. So, and I'll just say this, just as chief, it seems inconceivable to me that we could do that with how we're being able to serve our community right now, because if we do that, there's going to be 13,000 people a year that year that do not get the response time that we need. And that means more people are going to suffer and more people are going to die. Last time we closed a fire station, we had 2 people die in a fire at Station 8's district out at Chemeketa, like a week after we closed it. Our quickest engine to get there, which was in service at the time, was an 8-minute response. And that was engine 3. That was an appropriate response. It was a fully involved trailer. Engine 8 would have been there in 3 minutes. We found those 2 people at the kitchen door trying to get out. When we got there, the building was fully involved. We could not make entry. It was too hot. They were already dead. So, and at one point I had a reporter ask me, well, would you, what kind of response would you? I said, I would rather have a 3-minute response than an 8-minute response if I'm stuck in a trailer that's on fire. So that was a tragedy for our community, obviously. And, if we continue to see these kind of cuts and this kind of call volume, obviously the level of service will decline, especially in the areas where we close stations. So I'm going to jump into these slides real quick. I'm already way over my 5 minutes. And I don't have any pretty pictures like the last presentation. Those were awesome. I'm going to have to up the game, I think. So again, the breakdown here: general fund, fire protection, ambulance, contractor fee, life safety permits. You can see the ones with the asterisks are restricted. EMS fund is another one of those. WVCC is also an enterprise fund, so we are a fee for service. So our member agencies pay a fee, and then we provide the dispatch service for them. Now, Salem Police and Salem Fire also pay that fee, so the general fund pays that portion of it. Let's see, radio services on there as well. So our expenditures for next year, $82.2 million. $45 million for emergency operations, $2 million for prevention, $1.4 for administration. Our equipment in and out, that's a one direction. The emergency services fund is at $6 million in expenditures. That's because we're doing transport right now with our ambulance Medic 16, so we're generating revenue there, and we're having expenses to be able to cover that. And this is our career full-time equivalent positions. I will tell you that last year when I was here, we were down 21 positions in the fire department. We're down 10 right now, and we are preparing to have an academy and hopefully be fully staffed, hopefully by July. We were down 21 or 22 in the dispatch center. Right now we're down a total of 10, and we have 8 people in the recruitment going through the process to get into an academy. So I hope shortly we'll be fully staffed there as well. We've got a couple of management positions. We just filled a deputy chief spot, and we've got some operations manager positions to fill at the dispatch center. So I'm hoping that next year we'll be fully staffed and operational there. And I think that was my last slide. Happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Chief Knobloch. Are there any questions on the floor or online? Yes, Member Phillips, please.
Thank you, Chief. Just a question on the, the graph. I think it's page 18, where with the population increase and with the increasing call increases, and this kind of being on the small end, it's only predicting 6% growth in call volume per year, whereas this year's 14%. Is there any good news with the possibility that council might, approve moving in a direction where we take EMS services in-house? Like, would that mitigate that a little bit, potentially?
I think because we're talking about putting more hours into the system than it's currently available, yes, there could be some advantages there. You're not going to change this chart or the trajectory of this chart. By this growth, we should have 7 more fire stations over that 10-year period. We should have added 7 fire stations. We added 0. So there's some catch up to do here. So it's going to take some time to, it's like you can't turn a ship really quick. It's going to take some time to turn this. We have money in the bond to build Station 12. We don't have the money to staff it. That would have an immediate maybe 4% impact citywide. So each station you add starts, you start to see 3, 4, 5% a turn in your ability to meet that response time percentage. The ambulance system thing I would say is, we've talked about the revenue stream that's available there and potentially maybe using that revenue stream down the road after we stabilize in 3 to 5 years to do other things for the community, like community paramedicine or some of the other programs we talked about. So I think that would be a positive thing. But this really is about boots on the ground. So we need more fire station locations. We need more firefighters on duty. We need 111 more firefighters to meet the standard, the national standard of a 5-minute response at the 90th percentile. So that's a $25 million hit. I know that's not going to happen immediately, but we need to start thinking about, how far down the slope do we want to go? What's acceptable, for people not getting the response they need when they have a critical event? How far do we want to go down that slide before we start correcting the direction?
I guess I don't need the information now, but a follow-up question would be, do we know where we stand compared to other communities like Eugene, Bend, Portland?
I don't have their stats. I know that the national standard is tough to meet.
Yeah.
It's a high bar, but if it's your life or your loved one,
totally.
It's I can tell you, nobody we ever respond to expects us to get there late. They want us to get there early, and they're happy when we do. So that's just a perspective. We can certainly pull the data on that. Not everybody measures themselves to the national standard. So that may be, got to compare apples to apples.
Okay.
Thank you, Chief. I think I had Member Cohen and then Member Nordike.
Thank you. For the call volume growth, how much of that call volume growth is due to homelessness and drug overdose?
So that is a super popular question. I get asked that a lot. I think some of it is related to that. What I would caution, though, is it's mostly, there's 26,000 more people that have come to this community. So the more people you have in a small space, the more people are going to call 911. We're also, our study that we had done just recently indicates that we are an aging community as well. And, as people age, they have more need to call for medical services. So I think it's a combination of things. Certainly, we do, depending on which station you're talking about, if you're talking about the downtown station, they see a lot of homelessness calls and drug addiction calls. We see that all over the city. So that's certainly not helping, but I wouldn't say that's the entire culprit of our call volume. I think it's really the addition of the number of people. And I think we're predicting in the next 20 years to see another surge in population here in the community. So that will only make the call volume continue to increase.
Okay. 2 more questions. When we respond to unincorporated Marion County, unincorporated Polk County, or Lynn County, or wherever, how do we recuperate those costs?
So we have all of the agencies around us. So we're the biggest agency, but all the agencies around us, we have a mutual aid agreement. And so, and quite frankly, they respond to us more than we respond to them. We have more call volume, so we need their help more than we need to give them our help. So it's a mutually beneficial thing. There's no charge for that. Conversely, if we do a hazmat call, that's sponsored by the state. So a hazmat call, we get reimbursed for the training, we get reimbursed for the response. If we go to Lincoln City or we go to Sisters, Oregon for a hazmat response, we get reimbursed for that. Just like we do if we go to a wildland fire. There's a big wildland fire in Lynn County and we send a team down there. We get reimbursed through that, through the Conflagration Act. So those funds come back to the general fund. They don't come back to the fire department because we expend them one time and they come back to the general fund. So we get reimbursed for those. But as far as billing somebody else for a call, quite frankly, they come to us more than we go to them. So the mutual aid is to our benefit. I think we run about 400 mutual aid calls a year in the community. So out of 32,000.
Last question, which is an unfair question. When the employee payroll tax was going on, there was lots of social media saying that this is a scare tactic, this is a scare tactic. So my question to you is, where's the disconnect? Clearly, this should be a 5-alarm fire of we can't respond if grandma dies, or I just had a newborn baby a month ago. Like if my wife went into some sort of emergency and I needed a response and that response wasn't there, I could have lost a child. So it's clear that the need is there. Why does the citizenry not understand that need? Where is that disconnect, and how can we help out that disconnect?
Great question,
Once again,
Chief.
it's an unfair question, but I want you the truth, capital T.
The truth with a capital T. Well, I think first of all, I would just say that we've shared this information for many years. I've stood up at this podium and shown maps and graphs and charts, and I've tried to be transparent. This is on our website, and I don't know if that translates to people, feeling that that's critical. And the citizens have a right to vote whichever direction they wish to, and that's what we're left with. I mean, that's why we have a revenue task force right now looking at revenue to try to identify how we would respond moving forward. And we understand. I mean, we closed 2 stations back in 2009 or 2010. Took us 6 years to get them back open. So this isn't our first rodeo with having to close facilities. We're just super busy, more busy than we were then, and so it seems more urgent now to me as the chief, and I know to our staff who are running, double the calls they ran then. To me, it just seems inconceivable that we would go that direction. But at the end of the day, you can only pay for what you can afford. So if we have to make hard decisions, and none of the decisions are easy, we're going to have to make those hard decisions, and that's life.
Thank you, Chief. That was definitely a hard question. I'm probably sure we'll have more. Member Nordyke, and then it was Member Dixon, and then it was Member Hoy.
Thank you, Chief, and good job answering that, because that's not an easy question. So you say you need another 111 firefighters, and I'm just curious, are we staying competitive with other fire departments who also are not meeting that 90% threshold? And because I know I've shared this before, but I mean, it takes a lot of skill, a lot of training, a lot of courage to be a firefighter. And how do we keep Salem competitive when there's such demand for these professionals?
I would say we are very competitive right now. Our last labor contract placed us, I believe, towards the top of the state for our benefit package, and we recruited 40 lateral firefighters just recently. We just put 11 of them online last month, and we're looking at another academy of probably 10. They'll probably all be lateral employees who are coming from other departments to work in Salem. So I think right now we're competitive. It's important to remain competitive. We haven't always been competitive. We have struggled to recruit when we were down 21 positions. Now, part of that was the pandemic. You know, everybody was losing people during that. We lost a few ourselves, so that was a challenging time. I feel like we're in a good space right now for recruiting. We're recruiting well at the dispatch center. We're recruiting well in the fire department. And I anticipate that will continue for the next couple of years. And then, of course, as other agencies look at our contract and they say, okay, they're stealing people away from us, they're going to have to up their game. And unfortunately, right now, it's pay to play. If you want to get the good recruitment and you want to get the good employees, that's what you got to do. And so we're in a good space right now with that, and we're very pleased with the number that we saw turn out for us. We had 20 entry level and 40 lateral candidates in our last recruitment, and we used to get 10, so it was a big increase. Yeah.
Thank you, Chief. Member Dixon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The information that the chief provided about mutual aid agreements addressed my question, and Chief, I appreciate all of the information.
Thank you. Member Hoy.
Thank you. Just making some notes here. Chief, I wanted to ask about the call volume increase. When you count a call, is that strictly a fire call, and is that something you responded to, or are those just number of calls in to EMS?
So if we're dispatched on a call, so somebody calls a 911 and we're dispatched to it, it counts as a call, but we don't count. So let's say we have a structure fire, for example, and we're going to send 4 engine companies and a ladder company and a battalion chief and a medic unit. That's one call. But 5, 6 resources are responding to that. And if it becomes a second alarm or a third alarm, more resources come. The whole department might be there. You know, St. Joe's Church, the whole department was there. The fire out out south, the whole department was there. So that's one call. You know, it might take you a week to get through that call, but that's one call. So the total number of calls, encompasses everything. The non-emergency, lower acuity calls, the smoke investigation calls, that's the total number. The critical calls are the 13,000 number that I gave you. Those are the priority 3. We run with lights and siren. Time matters when we get there. Somebody's either not breathing, or they're bleeding to death, or their house is on fire, or their kids choking. Something critical's going on where their life is threatened. You know, there's a T-bone accident and they're pinned in the car and they got a lacerated liver, and they need to get to the OR in an hour. And so we got to cut them out of that car. We got to get them to the hospital, but time matters. So those are the calls that we time ourselves on because they're the most critical. We don't time ourselves on all 32,000.
But you were dispatched, or fire was dispatched to every one of those
Yes.
calls? Okay,
Yeah.
Thank you for that.
Well, let's go back for a second. There are some calls above that number that are medic only. So we have calls where we only send a medic unit because we don't need to send a fire truck. So we triage those calls. Those aren't in this number. This number is all the calls that fire trucks are dispatched to last year.
Thank you for that. I guess to Member Cohen's question about the type of calls that you're receiving and why there might be so many, I personally just feel that these are unprecedented times with the decriminalization of life-altering drugs, a huge spike in our behavioral health and addiction issues on the streets. I just have to believe that that's contributing quite a bit to what you guys are dealing with. and a lack of resources for those issues. So no place to go, so repeated calls. And then also I can attest to this, families in crisis who are dealing with those folks who then have situations arise because they're dealing with those issues. So I just have a strong feeling that that's a high contributing factor. And I really feel like I wish we could focus on addressing those issues at the heart of the matter to try to relieve some of the pressure on not only you, but police as well. So I just think we're a community in crisis. And when people are in crisis and there's a lack of hope, then there's a greater need to call for help. So that's just my thoughts. Thank you. I appreciate you.
Yeah, I think it certainly is a factor. I don't know the percentage-wise. Is it everything? It's probably not, but certainly we see plenty of overdose. We see plenty of situations with mental health issues, behavioral issues. Every day. So it's not, and there has been an increase in those call types, and we're seeing it. The whole West Coast is seeing that. So it's not specifically just Salem, but we have our fair share. I just don't know if that's the only driver in our increase in our call volume. I think it's population is another piece of that, and an aging population as well.
Thank you, Chief. We have Member Allen, and then there was Member Nordyke, and then Member Manville.
All right, thank you. Quick follow-up on a question that was asked earlier with regards to unincorporated areas. Does the Salem Fire Department continue to have contracts with rural fire protection districts?
Yes, we have. I call this a win-win in government. With Salem Suburban Rural Fire Protection District, we provide services to them, and they give us their tax revenue base, and it's about $1 million a year that goes into the general fund, or maybe a little less than $1 million. We run about 400 calls a year to that area, so that's a pretty good exchange of services. They would not be able to provide a department for $1 million a year, anything close to what we provide them. So it's been a really great relationship. I believe we recently just signed an extension of our agreement with them. In the past, they've helped us purchase apparatus. Our bond in 2007, they bought our 3 grass trucks, our 2 water tenders, and one of our fire engines with a bond that they ran simultaneously with our bond. So they've been really good partners, and it's an easy, we do all the administration for them, they collect the tax revenue, and they keep a little bit to, like $10,000 a year to cover their, maybe it's more than that, 15 grand to cover their tax needs and that kind of stuff, but we do everything else for them. So it's a really good, a good system, and it's been beneficial for both parties.
Thank you. My real question has to do with, in your comparisons, you had 43 on-duty firefighters from 2011 to current. However, on page 21, you have at least a 20% growth in what it says career full-time equivalent positions.
Sure.
So you have the same number of on-duty firefighters, but a 20% growth. So can you explain
Great
that?
catch, and I have a good answer for that, too.
I'm sure there is.
Yeah. So this last year, we added 3 positions for the flights that were coming in. So we would have a full-time person at the airport to man the ARF truck. So positions like that we've added over the years. Kelly Day Relief. Staffing to be able to allow people to take vacation and time off. We have added some FTEs. What we have not added, we still have 11 fire stations with 43 people on duty every day. So while we've added FTEs, we have not been able to add the 12 at once to open a new station. So that's the difference.
Okay, and then it's not a question, just a comment is with regards to something that was mentioned earlier. It's great to have competitive contracts. However, the greater the cost per resource, the fewer resources you can afford with fixed resources or revenues.
Well said. Thank you, Member Allen. Member Nordyke?
So I'm curious as to what you can do with AI and data to predict fire response. And the examples I think of, we already use this concept in a very analog way. There's always a medical team stationed at a football game because it's a matter of time before someone's going to get hurt, right? So we already do things like that. That's why you have firefighters stationed at an airport in the event of an incident. You want to have an immediate response time. But I'm curious, when you use Google to see how busy a restaurant is, and you talked about how the more population density you have, the more 911 calls you're just going to have, period. And the more perhaps senior facilities you have, the more calls you're going to have, period. So I'm wondering, what is your department doing to use this treasure trove of data that is out there to help predict where to respond? And can you use that to help with your response times?
So like many organizations, I'd say we are dabbling into AI and learning more about it. Look at my color of my hair. I'm not an AI expert, but I will tell you that, and I don't use a lot of social media either, but that's just me personally. I will tell you that we have some predictive software that we've had for quite a few years, and we can put historical data in that for like where we would position another fire station, where's our call volume, where's our long responses. If we've actually mapped out, if we had 20 stations, I don't know if that's ever going to happen, but that would be awesome. We mapped it out. We positioned them around town to provide the best level of service, and then we can actually tell from that prediction model what our response times will be. And so we do use some of that predictive analysis. It's not AI, but it's predictive analysis models that we use. We've had that for probably 5 years. I would say moving forward, we will probably use AI in more ways than we do now. You know, it's helping us write documents and some of those things. It's quicker. A lot of different things you can use it for. So we're just really scratching the surface. And I think Krishna will probably talk a little bit about that tonight because she's heading that team up. And we are inquisitive, I think, about how it could help us be more efficient and do our job quicker and take advantage of that, you know, that machine learning to be able to quickly come up with an answer that may have taken us longer to achieve before.
Thank you, Chief. We're actually going to take a 5-minute recess, and then we will come back and conclude with Chief, and then we'll move forward. So it's 1956, almost 8 o'clock. So we'll come back at 8:01. I thought Cohen had We are coming back. What, does this not sound like it's on at all?
I would just do this.
We are coming back. That does not sound like it's on.
The motion will be,
Wait
I'm
until
going
everybody
home.
stops talking.
It's not on, is it?
Yes, it is.
Now it's on?
Yeah, it's on. It's just the room's too loud.
We are coming back in 20 seconds. Coming back in 15. Coming back in 10. Coming back in 5.
And this is all open.
And we are back. Is that on?
Yes.
It sounds like somebody's turning me down. So I feel some kind of way. Chief DeBlock, we are back to you, sir. Any other questions on the floor? I think it was Member Manville, please.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Chief, of the 72% that are emergency medical response, do you have a breakdown on how many of those are traffic crash related? And generally, like, do you have a bunch of data on all your calls so we don't keep asking you questions and we can go do our research on the web or somewhere else?
Yes, we, on our website every year, we post a stats at a glance document that's 4 or 5 pages of how many house fires, how many car wrecks, how many brush fires, you know, all it's broken down on there.
Great.
So yeah, it's very broken out. We can make sure the budget committee gets a document sent to them if you'd like.
Okay.
Yeah.
And do you happen to know the traffic number off the top of your head?
Man, I hazard a guess. I don't have it off the top of my head. We have quite a few of those. One thing I will mention is, in an effort to make sure we're available for the more emergent calls, we have stopped responding to traffic accidents where there's fluids down, where there's non-injury. So pollution control is now responding to those, and there's about 400 a year of crashes like that, where there's just some radiator fluid down or some oil down. And we used to send a fire engine to that, but just with the call volume, we're having to figure out what's our priority, and our priority is the priority 1 calls. And so we've stopped responding to those. Somebody's still responding. It's just a little slower response at times, and it's the pollution control folks here at the city. So, and they have the same equipment we do to pick it up. So those are about 400 a year that we don't respond to now, but we have quite a few traffic crashes where there are injuries involved, where we need to respond to those. And we can provide that number to the committee.
I'll look into that. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, see, that sounds way better.
I got a little help here, 1,165
Thank you.
a year.
Any other additional questions? Yes, Vice Chair.
Thank you, Chair. So there's been some questions now on traffic and other types of calls. Would there be a separation of calls that were medical calls specifically to some of our senior centers or some of the centers for specifically elderly and really that I'm going to guess you go out to a lot? But I'm wondering if that is separated or if that is all combined with medical calls.
Those would be just in the medical call category. We can do I think we've done the data on this before on care centers, and the industry average is about a call per year per bed. So if you have 400 bed unit, you're going to have about 400 calls there a year on average. So yes, they do increase the call volume if you know a senior care facility is built next to a fire station, and a lot of times they are. That fire station's call volume is going to increase typically by the number of beds they have per year. So, and those are just categorized, and it depends on, I mean, if it's a heart attack, it's a different, higher level than if it's I've fallen. Now, we do work with these facilities because we've had to ask them, hey, if it's just a fall and they're not injured, we don't have the time to respond to that. So you need to train your staff to be able to take care of that. If it's injury, we're going to go. If somebody in their residence falls, we're going to go help them out, because that's what we're here for. But in a care facility where there's people there to take care of them and they've fallen down and they're not injured, we ask the care facility to take care of those. And so we've been able to push some of those calls back to the appropriate place where they need to go as well.
Please.
A follow-up to that then. So does the call center get that detailed for you so you know? Or does the call come into you and then you need to verify?
So if a call, you're talking about specifically a fall call? So if a call comes in, and this is, the employees at these centers are pretty transient. They change a lot in these kind of care facilities often. So we have to re-educate employees about what to call for and what not to call for. We always go to take care of the person. If we get there and it's like non-medical, it's not a need, then we use education. We write letters to them saying, hey, here's the ORS on this. You're supposed to provide this care. You know, most of those folks that are in there are paying $8,000, $9,000, $10,000 a month to be cared for, and they're using the fire department to pick people up. So we really take a pretty aggressive stance with that, and we've been able to reduce the number of care centers that are calling us for that. So that's been an effective measure. We still go, if it comes to the 911 center, we'll still go to it just to make sure. We always err on the side of safety for that, but then we re-educate them if it's not a 911 type call or a need for us to be there.
Thank you.
And Chief, just to follow up Vice Chair's call, so you stated earlier that if there is a structural fire, there's a house fire, and quite a few trucks go, and so you have a lot of, service there for one call. Do we know how much it varies in cost? For instance, like if you have a structural fire, that's going to require so many people and so many trucks, as opposed to an accident. Like, how do you distinguish, or how do you know which call costs more?
Well, I can tell you the structure fire call costs more because there's more vehicles there.
Right.
We really don't, I mean, we're always trying to be responsible with the funds that the taxpayers provide us to provide the most efficient service we can. Our mission is to save lives and protect property. So those are our two priorities. So we always try to err on the side of, that's why we send 8 people to a heart attack, because that is the best chance of survival that person has. If we sent 2, not very many of them would survive. We save about 25 people a year that have a heart attack, get to the hospital in time, get resuscitated, and they walk out of the hospital with no neurological deficit, back to their families, back to their jobs, and they're still alive. If we sent 2 people to those calls, very few of those people would walk out of, maybe not even get to the hospital. There's just enough people to take care. So we always want to have the right tools, the right people, and get there quickly to do what we need to do to mitigate the situation, to put it back to normal as quickly as possible. Mm-hmm. So, a fire like the fire we had, the brush fire out south, we had every vehicle there. We called airplanes in, for an air attack. We had mutual aid people, we had police, we had emergency management people, we had evacuations, we had people taking livestock out of the area. I mean, it's a whole deal. That's an expensive operation,
right?
Compared to 2 car wrecks. It's a different kind of scenario. But we base everything like for conflagration fires for reimbursement. There's a state reimbursement rate for what does a fire truck cost by type. How many people are on it? What's the rank? What's the reimbursement for that? The fuel. So there's a way to figure out how much does it cost to send a fire truck somewhere. We've got those numbers, but we don't really. I guess when the 911 call comes in, we go take care of that.
Right.
So whatever it takes to do that and to keep our people safe and the community safe is our main focus.
Right. Well, I want to say one thing. Like a couple weeks ago, I had the luxury. I call it a luxury because I went on a ride along in District 1, and it was an eye-opening experience. I'll just say that. It's nothing like Chicago Fire at all. How do I know? Because I asked them that.
It is not.
It is not. So this is what I do know. I know that the driver, that is your apparatus operator, right? And then you have your captain that's in the passenger seat, and then behind him there's another firefighter. Mm-hmm. And where I was sitting was right next to the other firefighter. The seat that I was in, it was empty. Is that supposed to be filled by another firefighter?
We have 3 on each truck. So we have a captain, a driver, and a firefighter. That's our staffing levels right now. If you're talking about NFPA standards for staffing, it's 4 per truck, 4 per engine, and we have never been able to have enough funds to be able to do that. So we staff with 3 on each engine, and we'd like to staff with 4 on the ladder trucks, but most days there are 3 as well.
From station to station, there are 3?
There are 3, every station.
Okay. Thank you for sharing. Were there any other final questions on the floor? None.
Thank you.
We appreciate you. Was that a motion? Okay. So Chief Womack is going to come and share his part, and we are looking at the clock. And I know there are some of you in here that really want to stay until midnight, and there are some of us do not. And so one of the things that we're going to ask is that after the chief finishes his presentation and there are questions, if Chief can finish and we get our questions, I'm going to ask that a motion, we can have a motion that we can end at 8:30. So just putting that out there now that we will not be here all night. This will be the last presentation. So Chief Womack, please take it away, sir.
Great, thank you. I'll watch the clock there for 15 minutes. Thank you, Chair Brown and fellow committee members. First, real quick, I do have to just say my sincere thank you for the work you do. I know there's a lot of work that goes into pre-meeting, and then here we are 2.5 hours into this meeting, so I just want to say thank you. Councilor Nordyke, I already mentioned that you're volunteers, and so I really appreciate your time and your thoughtfulness as we go through this process together. So quick overview of the police department. I'm not going to spend much time on this because generally speaking, people kind of know what the police department does in general, right? We provide public safety services here in the city of Salem, and especially it includes our 911 emergency response to calls in the field. That we do that with about 250 staff that are organized in 3 divisions within the department. Each division is headed by a deputy chief, and I have those listed here. So we have our field operations division, which is the most visible side of the police department. Police officers out in patrol cars handling calls for service, traffic officers doing enforcement and education, investigating crashes, those sort of things. We have an investigations division, which is our plainclothes detectives that follow up on major cases and try to solve crimes. And we also have some other attachments there too with our downtown bicycle team, which we call our community action unit, our 2 homeless service teams officers that work with unmanaged encampment situations. Forensics and crime lab are in there as well. And then finally our support division, which is a critical division for us, keeps everybody running and moving, so we have all of our recruiting, hiring, meeting all of our training standards. Professional standards as well, so accountability measures like investigating officer complaints against officers and so forth. All that's within our support division. So 250 staff divided up within 3 divisions within the department is how we're structured. And quickly, before I move on into the overview of the budget too, I do want to mention we have a lot of information on our transparency portal. If you just Google Salem Police Department Transparency Portal, you'll find all sorts of things there with data and information if you want to dive in deeper, right? A community policing assessment that happened in 2021, an independent staffing assessment that we followed up on that, talking about our staffing needs. We have a 15-year crime summary. More recently, we kicked off our community violence reduction initiative, so there's data in there about the shootings that are increasing in our community. So there's a lot of data and information there if you want to dive in deeper. So with that, I click here, see if that works. There we go. Quick overview on our budget. So like the fire department, the police department is heavily dependent upon general fund. And so I think one of the main takeaways for me when we look at our resources or revenues here at this slide is just how much we're dependent on the general fund. So the blue portion plus the orange portion there is our general fund revenues. And so the vast majority of the police department comes from general fund. So the takeaway obviously is if you increase or reduce the general fund, then it has a heavy impact on the police department, everything that we do. And when I talk about the police department, primarily I'm talking about people. People are the majority of the costs. Let's click through this here. So when we talk about our expenditures, how do we spend that money? $59 million from the general fund there is broken down on the left side. You can kind of see how that's broken up by the divisions that I talked about, just to give you an idea where that money is directed and where it goes. So just under $1 million goes to administration, includes things like me and the staff that help run the police department. And then support divisions, about $20 million, $10 million for investigations. And the vast majority goes to patrol. That's where most of our staff are, and the resources are for our patrol division with $28 million. Let's take a look now, though. When you break up those costs between people and materials and services, so I thought it was important to show that picture, also to show that the vast majority of costs for the police department are personnel, right? That large part of the pie there, almost 80% are the costs for staff. The small slice of the pie is for everything else to help the staff do their jobs, right? The materials and services at 21%. So again, we're highly dependent on the general fund revenue. The vast majority of costs are people themselves. And it also starts to give you an idea that you can't really solve big deficit problems with the general fund through materials and services. It's such a small sliver of the cost for the police department. Let's take a look at just those material and services, that small piece of that pie that we just saw. When you break that down, there's a certain amount that we have some amount of control over That's the smaller slice over there. That's about $4 million of the 12. And then the bigger slice, that blue slice, is the $8 million, which we have much less control over. That's revenue that comes in and costs that increase that I have nothing to do with. So a big example would be at the top of the list on the right. The fire chief mentioned it. We pay for the cost of services for dispatch out of our general fund as well. So that cost for that service for us out of my general fund went up 6% this year. It's going up 7% next year. So those costs of running that center are borne out by the partner agencies as well, including myself, and I have no control over what happens with those costs. So those costs are increasing completely outside of my control. I have much more control on the smaller slice of the pie there. And I show that just because when we're asked, for example, an exercise that we just went through to cut 1% out of our materials and supplies budget, our services budget, it's the small slice that we can actually cut from. We can't cut from that, 66% of the pie you see there. We can only really control and cut from that small slice. It's extremely impactful, even a 1% cut, because that's like our training budget. You need a certain amount of bulletproof vests for everybody. You need a certain amount of bullets and all this equipment that we have to have that you can't really cut either. And so it really narrows the slice of the pie even smaller as far as what can we cut, what services or what costs can we cut out of materials and services are really relatively narrow. You get to a point where you can't provide adequate training, you can't provide adequate equipment, and we are already a very, very lean department in that regard. This slide is similar to the ones you'll see from other departments where it shows a 10-year snapshot of staffing within the police department. It's broken down by the sworn police officer type positions from chief of police down to police officer, all the ranks, and then the non-sworn on the bottom there as well. You see a slight amount of steady growth there on the non-sworn side. So those are positions like our community service officers, our records, in our records section, crime lab. There's a lot of non-sworn staff, office support staff, in that batch there, but the majority of the staff are the sworn side. And you can see there's a large stretch there for, 6 years where there was no growth whatsoever, 187 in authorized budgeted police officer positions for a number of years. We began to increase a little bit over these past 2 or 3 years, but you can see already because of the mid-year budget adjustment we just took last month, we lost 4 positions, so we're immediately starting to head back down to that no growth kind of range. I wanted to show you something a little more impactful, I thought, and I want to sit on this slide a little bit longer because for me this is the biggest takeaway and the most important thing that I can explain to everyone tonight is this slide. There's a lot of information here, so again, I just want to sit on this for a minute. This is a 20-year snapshot because the prior slide doesn't show the full story when you're just looking at 10 years. If you look at that little box in the middle, it covers all of 2013 through 2020, so I want to make sure I point that out. That's, an 8-year period there really, where we had 187 positions, period. So there's an 8-year period in the middle where there was no growth as far as staffing. Oftentimes I do look at the budget, and of course the costs have gone up. People will say, well, your budget has increased. Well, of course costs are going up. I'm talking about the number of staff that we have. So there's an 8-year period in the middle where there's no growth. If you look at 2008, we had 16 years ago, we had 196 authorized positions. The Great Recession hit us, right? City took some hits. That's why you see us going down to 187 there. Then there's that 8-year period. We're well below where we were in 2008. We began to climb back up, and now we took the last 4 positions I just lost last month. It puts us back at 196 again this year, which is the same number in 2008. So we are at the same level of police staffing for sworn side that we had 16 years ago. If you look back further, the 20-year shot, if you look at 2004, we were sitting at 187 and 186 the next year. We projected out what's going to happen if nothing changes with our budget here. The current year that you all are talking about, we're not expected to lose any additional sworn positions. I am expected to possibly lose a graffiti abatement technician on the non-sworn side. So you still see 196 there on that one. But at 2026, when we're talking about the potential for 12 police officer cuts, that will put us back 19 years ago. We'll be operating with the same staff we had 19 years prior. And so I want to emphasize that point because I don't know I don't care what kind of business you're operating or governmental agency you're operating. If your service demands are increasing, we can talk about that, and your population is growing, and you're still trying to function and manage and operate a police department with the same staffing you had 20 years ago, it causes extreme problems. And so this is the story that I've been telling, and it's a bit of a morbid analogy, but it's the best way I can think of describing it is death by 1,000 cuts. And so when you have a period of zero growth for this long, The top orange line there is our population growth. We overlaid that as well, so you can see how our population has grown there. It's over $40,000 there, 40,000 people there from 2004 to 2024. So at least 40,000 more people in our community have grown while our staffing has stayed flat. It's the death by the thousand cuts. The only choice you have when you have a hold the line budget for technically 20 years is to pull back. As your service demands increase over here, for example, we're having more shootings in our community. Those take a lot more resources to handle, a lot more time to investigate. I'm gonna have to pull people, without any additional resources, I'm gonna have to pull people away from somewhere else and assign them to that. So we cut our auto theft detective a couple years ago, our last one. There's little cuts that we're making every year to keep pace with this service demand. And I call it the death by a thousand cuts because they're small and the community doesn't really feel or notice what's happening necessarily, but the staff definitely does. The more workload's happening with fewer people in this scenario. And so that's where we find ourselves today. Quickly here, that straight line across the middle there, that red line, it says 1.5. We're going to talk about per capita ratios a little bit here. The red line there and the blue line below it are related. They're interrelated. And so back in 2004 or 2005, I found a news report, and it was an article in the local media. And the council at that time approved a policy to staff the police department at 1.5 officers per thousand. We've never been at 1.5 officers per thousand. That's also a number you've heard me use in the past as far as on the West Coast for agencies our size with the type of problems we're dealing with. It's a good thumbnail number. It's not perfect, but it is a good thumbnail number to measure yourself against. 1.5 officers per thousand, we've never been there. In fact, 2008, the last time we had 196 officers, the ratio back then because of our population was almost 1.3 officers per thousand, 1.29. And you can see where we're headed now. Today we sit at 1.07 officers per thousand. If nothing changes here, we're going to head below 1.0 officers per thousand. This is why in my recent community message, I said I'm extremely concerned about additional cuts to the police department budget. We need more police officers, not less. The independent staffing analysis that I just referred to estimated we needed anywhere from 27 to 83 police officers. We figured that was around 60 for our community to do the work we need to do. So we need many more police officers, not less. So we can bend and bend and bend, but we're about to snap, and that's what worries me in the community. So right now we're in a completely responsive mode. Responsive mode. That's like I talked about, we just had a recent shooting at the park. We're responding, we're reacting to things that are happening. We want to try to get ahead of those. And it takes top officers with time to be able to invest in proactive work, not just responsive mode. Death by a thousand cuts leads you to responsive mode. You're just getting to emergency calls as fast as you can and following up. So with that, happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Chief Womack. Any questions on the floor or online? Member Nordike, and then Member Cohen, and then Member Geyer.
Thank you, Chief, and I want to say thank you to you and all of the members of your team who responded to that shooting. That was a terrifying incident, and as I understand it, we had a great response in a short amount of time, so I appreciate that and how hard your team is working to take these serious incidents as serious as possible. So please extend my gratitude to your officers and all the other first responders who were involved in that incident, one of many that we've been having lately. Similar question to fire department. What are we doing to keep our department competitive compared to other departments? We don't have as many individuals nationwide as interested in a career in law enforcement. You've spoken to that many times. It's not a Salem issue. That's a national issue. Yes. So what are we doing to keep our department competitive?
Very good. So, excuse me. With our union, our Salem Police Employees Union, SPEU, they were in a 4-year contract. It's just coming up to negotiations, so we have folks from HR here too. We're in the middle of negotiations with our union right now. I can tell you that it's okay to say that we are behind market. We all acknowledge that we are behind market. At the same time, we were struggling with some of the issues we're seeing nationally as far as attracting and recruiting and retaining people, highly competitive environment. What I will say, though, is very positive, even in that environment, in that situation. Last year, when I was standing before you and asking questions or answering questions about vacancies, at one point we had 26 police officer vacancies, and today we have 12. We're going to hire 4 more on April 1st. We're very soon, we're going to get back under the 10 vacancy mark, and we're going to get even lower than that throughout the rest of this year. So we have come out of this hole. I was saying it all along, it's a temporary issue. We will get out of this, and we have, but it's taken a lot of hard work. But we do need to pay, and benefits, of course, is an important part. And so as we go through this process, we need to make sure that we're at market or above, right, if we're going to compete for and retain the employees. I'm beginning to see, we were having officers leave our department for other agencies, even smaller agencies around us, which is unusual. We're beginning to see officers come back now. So we're attracting more laterals as applicants now too, which is a good positive sign. So I think that speaks to where we're headed as an organization, but also that we are competitive.
Member Cohen?
Yes. Thank you for your leadership last week or 2 weeks ago, whenever you did the event at the East Salem Town Hall. It was very poignant, and I saw a lot of familiar faces, so hopefully you guys show up. I think there are 3 more of them.
Yes.
So please come. The question that I have is the gang enforcement team was disbanded in 2019. I think during your presentation, 51% of the shootings were gang related. How much would it cost to restart that program?
That was 2 officers. So it's $300,000-$400,000 to hire to add two officers to the budget. But the thing is I wouldn't create a gang enforcement team. That's not what I would do. I would, for me, yes, 50% of the data show that about 50% of our shootings were gang involved or related. These aren't traditional gangs in Salem like you might see on TV, right, where it's not Nuestra Familia in here. They're not running some giant criminal operation. If you think of these kids that were involved here, was it gang related or not? I'm not prepared to say, but I don't think they're running a major criminal operation. These are groups of individuals that are associated with each other. They get in disputes over whatever, right, whatever sort of criminal behavior or disputes they're in, and they tend to have more violence. So to me, it's much more about the violence and the behaviors that are occurring rather than whether something's a gang, somebody's associated with a gang or not. So we would need a team that's focused on shootings and following that data, not necessarily just 2 officers that we call the gang enforcement team. We need a team of 5, 6 officers and a sergeant that are going to respond to all fatal and non-fatal shootings, not just homicides, for example. If you think about the way detectives get called out for homicides, it's usually a matter of inches between a homicide and a non-fatal shooting. So we should treat them all the same. We should have the same level of response for every person that gets hit with a bullet in our community, and we need those sort of resources. So for me, I would rather create a larger team that's dedicated on this entire issue of gun violence, which is going to cost more than just 2 officers that we call a gang enforcement team.
That's 5 to 6 on top of where you're at now.
Yeah, I don't have a team like that currently.
Thank you, Member Cohen. Member Geyer?
In your estimation, which calls or what calls are stressing the system the most?
Oh, a lot. And Councilor Nordyke often asks the question. I think she just asked the fire chief related too about, maybe you didn't, but it came up in the conversation. Folks in behavioral health crisis. I do think there's an increase in calls because of addiction and behavioral crisis, or a combination of both. But you have to be careful when you say that too, because just because it is a call that involves behavioral health crisis or addiction doesn't mean there's not also criminal behavior involved or danger involved. And so you can't say if there's 20 or 25% of calls that involve somebody in crisis that we could somehow create a different program to eliminate those calls for the police, because the vast majority we already screen. The type of calls we go to is because there's a threat. There's some sort of very concerning behavior that require the police to be there. But I do think that's a contributing factor. There's definitely more calls because of the behavioral crisis that we're in as a country, and the increase of addiction as well. Those are contributing factors. We're also seeing just with our encampments. So when you have, obviously not everybody that's homeless is a criminal. I'm not trying to say anything like that. But if you have unmanaged encampment situations in our community, it increases calls for service. There's business owners and operators, there's homeowners that are having issues in front of their homes or businesses. They're going to call the police because people are trespassing or they're doing behaviors that are low-level criminal behaviors, and they draw police in more often. So I do think the fact that we have an increase of homeless, especially unmanaged situations, it does increase our call load also.
Thank you.
Were there any additional questions on the floor? Member Manville.
Thank you, Chair. So I'm thinking about trade-offs in your budget and looking at, I think it was a revenue committee thing, noting the new roughly $1 million a year that we spend on body-worn cameras. How do you think about that question of the value of those cameras, the effectiveness of those cameras versus redirecting those resources to something like Member Cohen talked about or something like that?
Multiple thoughts on this. First of all, that $1 million includes some staff too, right? So it's not just the camera that costs money. There's some staff behind it. That's a standard piece of law enforcement equipment in my mind now, and we're extremely at risk of exposure in various ways if we don't have it. There are still lawsuits that we're facing for high-profile police incidents that have occurred several years back before we had cameras, where we don't have adequate video evidence of those that give us more liability exposure as a city, and that's playing out. So the fact that we now have excellent camera footage of every sort of critical incident we go to, audio and video, helps lower the costs of liability for the city. So it's hard to estimate what that would be, but there is a value add there from having cameras on all of our calls. It also has drastically lowered, so far it's been 1 year that we've had these cameras, we've drastically lowered our complaints against police officers. Our formal complaints where someone makes an allegation of misconduct, we spend hours and hours investigating it, interviewing multiple people. Those have dropped off, or they've been proven to be unfounded immediately because you're able to watch exactly what happened, and you're even able to show the complainant, here's what actually happened, and they maybe have a different perception of what occurred. And when they look at that objective video, they're like kind of, oh, never mind, this isn't really what happened. We're able to kind of prove that it was unfounded so much quicker. So it saves a lot of staff time with those investigations. So it's hard to tally up that cost there. But personally, you're asking my opinion. I think it's a standard piece of police equipment that we can't operate without for various reasons, for the accountability and the transparency and the liability that we're seeing sometimes. I wouldn't want to exchange it for another team. I think we need all of that. It's not or, it's both. Appreciate that.
Member Curtis.
This is more of a comment than a question. I attended the Salem Reporter's town hall on gun violence, and I just really appreciated your comments about we're not policing like we were in 1993, I think was maybe a direct quote, and that we have to really look at who our partners may be in these neighborhoods where we have, you know, the high percentage of incidents. The woman who was from the Neighborhood Association in Northeast was talking about the importance of graffiti being removed. I mean, just something which seems simple, you know, maybe to the person that doesn't know. So I think, you know, as we go forward, I think your attitude about looking at new ways of doing things, finding new partners, you know, we'd love to give you all the money we can, but that might not be, you know, practical. I just appreciate your
That's right.
Your attitude. So
I appreciate that.
Thank
I'm
you.
a firm believer that police aren't the only answer to the solution, I think. But there is, I would go backwards if I could. When I looked at that last slide, there is a baseline number of police officers that you need for public safety. That's what I'm trying to say here. And you've got to make sure you have adequate resources to handle the basic core services that we need to provide. And then you find as many partners as you can to help with everything else. And so right now, we don't have either.
Member Allen. And then Member Nordyke, you had a question, right? Member Nordyke? Okay.
Just real quick, with the previous chief, there was a question about Chicago fire. So I just want to know if what you do is the same as what I see on the rookie.
It's exactly.
Okay, thank you.
Yes. That's why I love this job so much, yes.
Since we're talking about Chicago, no. I do have a question, but Member Nordyke, you go ahead.
Sure. When we first approved, we voted to approve body cameras a while ago on council. I remember it might have been the year 2020, I think. And we got some money from the state up front, which was wonderful, to help start up that program. Have we exhausted those funds, and are we receiving more state funds to cover the cost of our body camera program?
Yes, my expert there is helping me out and saying that money has been exhausted. So that's been absorbed by the general fund. And you gave me another thought, if I may, is that we also used to have, we're losing other revenue as well. Right, so along the way, just since I've been here, it's been almost 3.5 years now, We used to have funding from our school district to pay for SRO positions, and that money stopped. That was about $600,000 a year that we don't have any longer. So there's revenue disappearing as well. We had an agreement with Chariots that we provided some services to them, and that it funded about $130,000 worth of a police officer. We lost that, so right there. And we're now losing our funding from the county for mobile crisis response teams. That's coming soon. That's going to be another 2 officers that were funded for that. So along the way, other things are happening too, right? We're losing, not only do we have a structural imbalance the way our general fund is from property tax, that exists, we're also losing other forms of revenue that we had relatively rapidly here just in the past few years.
Any other questions on the floor? Member Nordike.
Sure, that did prompt a follow-up. Another thing that is new since you started with us, Chief, is 988. So 988, we now have a designated hotline for suicide calls. And as I understand it, many of those 988 calls do result in some sort of law enforcement response. But I don't think there's any, so you might be getting more calls, but I don't think you're getting more money from the advent of 988. Am I making a series of assumptions here? Please let me know if I'm wrong in any of those assumptions.
So far, and I can't speak to 980 very well, right? We know that Northwest Human Services kind of takes those calls and screens them. And a lot of those, I think their primary objective is to handle them over the phone. So there's a certain amount that I'm not aware of that they're just handling over the phone. But there's been very few, if any, actual transfers to handle for police. We're still taking the majority of those. People are mostly still calling 911. And so we need to figure out a way to coordinate better to where we can go back and forth with that if we need to refer, vice versa. And there's a lot of change happening and things are new. But even with the new teams that the county is standing up to respond to calls 24/7, we'll have to figure out how we coordinate. And now that we're separating a bit, is how do we still coordinate our response on things?
Any other follow-up questions? Vice Chair?
Thank you, Chair. So recently, the council had to cut vacant positions in the police department. And we also are hearing, thankfully, that you're actually hiring more.
Yes.
So I'm kind of trying to understand at the point where if you're able to hire the police officers that you want, would we then have any vacancies available to hire more, should that be something you have the ability to do?
I think there'll always be a certain amount of vacancy rate. You're talking about an agency with about 200 police officers. So there's always going to be attrition. And the process itself takes 6 months plus to even hire a police officer and then put them through the academy. So there's always this delay and how long it takes to hire and then what's your attrition rate. And it's an imperfect science. I mean, we can identify how many police officers at retirement age right now. But when they decide to retire is just who knows, or if there's somebody that's terminated or separated. So there's unexpected separations as well. So you'll always have attrition and you'll always have a certain amount of vacancy rate. And where I've been comfortable talking about is a 5% vacancy rate for our organization rather than a 10% vacancy rate. And so we're getting closer now to where we're at a more normal vacancy rate. When you get that close, you start to make decisions. We don't take any more applications right now because we only have 0 vacancies. So you start to actually slow down on your hiring a little bit. We haven't reached that yet. And so, but there will come a point if we have almost no vacancies, we'll decide when we open up recruitments and when we close recruitments and to just fill the vacancies that we need to fill. But this is also why I've been saying we don't cut vacant positions to save money. They're going to be filled. My intention is to fill these positions, and the wrong answer to save money for the city is to look at vacant police positions. They're going to be filled. We need every position we have. Just because they're vacant right now doesn't mean there's not a need there, and the calls aren't still being handled by the staff that are actually working right now. We need to fill all those positions, and so it's dangerous to cut vacant positions as well. Those 4 that we cut were a lieutenant, a sergeant, and 2 police officer positions. So we kind of went through all ranks there with that first round of cuts.
I'm going to follow that question, Vice Chair. So Chief, the shooting from last week, obviously there's a lot of pain and hurt, and because there's a loss of life, a kid. Hypothetically speaking, if there were an SRO back in our schools, do you think that would have been prevented?
No way to know the hypothetical there. SROs were in the schools, and so you had a police officer that was much more engaged with the dynamics that are happening with kids, and so there was an information and understanding source there that was embedded with the school that's not there anymore. So, but who knows on that hypothetical?
Okay, so I'll get rid of the hypothetical part. So the superintendent recently said that they're talking about having some type of weapons detection system in their school. Are you a part of that conversation?
I've been part of initial conversation, yes. I know she indicated she's kind of having to announce that faster than she wanted to because of what happened. So the conversation's moving faster than even she wanted to have it, I think.
And do you think going forward, whatever type of system that is, would that be something that the school would be a part of and not Salem PD?
Yes.
Or would it be a partnership?
Well, we always have a good partnership. We still
Okay.
do. Even after the separation of the SRO program, we still have a person within our department that is a direct liaison with Salem Kaiser Schools. We talk regularly. We're engaged on threat assessments together, for example. So that still happens. That relationship never went away. And so these type of conversations we have regularly also. But from my understanding, it's not any staffing demand on the police department for that equipment. That would be something that they ran themselves. Yeah.
Got it. Are there any other questions for Chief Womack? Yes. Member Nordike.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And this may or may not be a homework assignment for later. You talked about unmanaged encampments provoking 911 calls. What about our managed shelter sites? I would be curious to see the data on how many police calls we've had to our managed shelters. I do know that they have staffing and security for a reason, in order to ensure the safety of everybody who comes to those shelters.
We've done some analysis on that within the past year, maybe. So I might not even have to freshen it up necessarily because I still think it's pretty accurate. I can get that to you. The call volume was not bad at all. It didn't go up. What we found, there's no impact on the calls in the neighborhood, so forth. It doesn't increase calls or service demand. So for me, that speaks to the fact that it's much less demanding on our resources in an unmanaged situation because it didn't increase and have a negative impact on the neighborhood.
Thank you, Chief Womack. Any other questions? Yes,
Okay, we're
Member
already
Phillips.
way past my time.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Chief. So, I mean, I think this year, my guess is there won't be a change to any of the major buckets. So, like, what we're looking at is probably status quo. But in the year after and moving forward, we're going to be in the impossible position of, like, if we don't raise revenue, like, what do we cut? And
Yeah, it's going to be that 184 number there.
so I just, like, how do we, I mean, I've asked before the rhetorical question, like, are we in triage mode right now? It really feels like we are. I mean, these are going to have real world consequences when you get down below, like, one person per 1,000. I've not seen anywhere, any other municipality that does something like that. But, like, the trade-off between that and closing a fire station, like, I don't understand. Is there any communication between the departments, like, to figure that out and balance that equation? I mean, I feel like you need both. You can't just have police, you can't just have fire. But, like, how will you help guide us through this triage-like process?
Yeah, I think there are already projections for fire cuts as well. Yes.
Yes, there are. And as I said when we started this conversation this evening, we take a first-team approach to how we develop our budget proposal. And using the criteria in the principles, we start by looking at what can we reasonably preserve in police and fire. And what the approach that we've taken is we've delayed significant cuts, the 12-person reduction, until giving ourselves enough time to have this discussion and go through the revenue task force process and see if the community has a willingness and appetite to support additional services and additional funds. And if that's not the case, then we're going to have some very hard decisions to make. We are going to be in a situation where we're having to balance between police officers, fire stations, library, parks and recreation maintenance, general service provision across the city. Those are just the brutal facts that we're going to have to be confronted with as we move forward through this process.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions for Chief Womack?
Thank you all
None.
again.
Thank you, Chief. We appreciate you. So, committee members, we are approximately at 20:48, also 8:48. How are you feeling? I'll answer that for you. So we are at 8. Yes, ma'am.
Well, I was going to say that we have made it halfway through the presentation agenda, right?
Correct. We have 4 more.
And I know there had been a request for additional meetings. I believe that the conversation that we're having is very important and impactful on decisions, and we should think about adding more meetings.
Okay. More meetings. Yes. Member Stapleton.
I move that we adjourn for the evening and ask staff to schedule another meeting to help us meet the request of Councilor Gwen and others.
Second.
So there were 2 seconds. There's a motion by Member Stapleton. CFO Eggleston. Yes, sir.
If I could clarify, the motion is to add an additional meeting. You have 1 scheduled for next week and 4 already scheduled.
Let me ask a question then. Did you have an agenda already set for next week?
No, it's strictly
Oh,
for the
okay.
carryover from
It's
this
part
meeting.
2.
There's
Oh,
no new
fantastic.
additional
Okay.
information.
Fantastic. Then my motion is so amended that we adjourn for this evening and pick this up again next week.
Yes, and it was seconded by Phillips and also seconded by Nordyke. Member Jern.
I guess, should we vote? I have to vote.
Meeting adjourned.